Hello beautiful people. Welcome to Fiction Blue. In today's episode, we explore Harry used accidental legilimency on Vernon at age 5 and discovered Petunia had been paid by Dumbledore to mistreat him. Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The crack in the wall. The rain had been going since morning. Harry could tell by the smell of it, that wet concrete, worm-on pavement smell that crept under the gap beneath the cupboard door and settled into everything. His blanket, the pillow with the broken zipper that scratched his cheek at night, the single paperback with half its cover torn away that he'd found behind the washing machine. Everything in the cupboard smelled like rain when it rained, which was most days, because this was Surrey and this was October and that was simply how things were. He was 5 years old. He had learned not to mind the small things. The shouting had started an hour ago, which meant it was probably past 5 o'clock, because Vernon didn't raise his voice before he'd eaten. That was one of the rules Harry had figured out on his own, one of dozens of small, unwritten rules that governed life at number 4, Privet Drive, and that nobody had ever explained to him. He'd worked them out by watching. By noticing when Aunt Petunia's shoulders went tight, or when Dudley's face arranged itself into a particular shape right before he came looking for someone to push around. Harry noticed things. It was, as far as he could tell, the most useful thing about him. The shouting tonight was about work. Vernon's voice moved through the thin cupboard wall in waves, deep and ugly, all consonants, with Petunia's higher register rising to meet it in a way that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite argument either. More like weather meeting weather. Harry pulled his knees to his chest and opened his torn book to a page he'd already read 17 times, a picture of a red boat on a blue sea, and breathed through his mouth so he didn't have to smell the rain as much. He wasn't afraid of the shouting, exactly. He'd been more afraid of it, once. He remembered being very small, smaller than he was now, which was difficult to imagine since he was already quite small, and pressing his fists over his ears when the voices got loud. He didn't do that anymore. Pressing your fists over your ears didn't make the sound stop, it just made your elbows ache. A door slammed somewhere in the house. The vibration moved through the wall and into Harry's back. Then footsteps, heavy and irregular, which was wrong because Vernon's footsteps were always heavy but never irregular. That was the step of someone angrier than usual, someone not entirely paying attention to where they were going. The cupboard door flew open. Harry had exactly 1 second to look up before Vernon's hand closed on the front of his oversized, hand-me-down shirt and hauled him out of the cupboard and into the hallway. The hallway light was very bright after the dark of the cupboard. Harry squinted. Vernon's face, when it swam into focus, was the color of a cooked beet, that specific, particular red that meant the shouting hadn't been enough and now something else needed to happen. His tie was loosened. There was a spot of something on his collar. "What did you do?" Vernon said, and it wasn't a question. "I was in my cupboard," Harry said. "Don't give me that." Vernon's grip tightened. Harry felt his feet leave the floor, which was less frightening than it might have been because Vernon had done this before and had always put him back down. This was information Harry held on to. "Higgins called me into his office today. Said 2 contracts fell through." 2. A vein in Vernon's forehead was doing something complex. "Grunnings has been my client for 11 years and now he won't return my calls. You want to explain that to me?" Harry did not see how he was supposed to explain Vernon's work problems, given that he had spent the entire day in primary school learning about the letter Q, but he understood that this was not a conversation that required his genuine participation. Vernon wanted somewhere to put the feeling. Harry was where feelings got put. "Freakishness," Vernon said. The word came out of him like something he'd been holding in all day. "I've told Petunia, I've said it 100 times, there's something rotten in this house and it's that boy and I can feel it affecting things, I can feel it." He shook Harry once, sharply, the way you'd shake a jar with a stuck lid. And Harry, who had learned to endure without flinching, who had calibrated himself to smallness and stillness and absence, Harry felt something move inside his chest. Not fear. Something else. Something that had been sitting very quiet and very deep and that the shaking had disturbed, the way you disturb sediment at the bottom of a glass. Vernon's face was very close to his. The vein in his forehead was still doing its thing. His eyes were small and pale and furious, and Harry looked into them without meaning to, looked into them the way you fall, just gravity, just the simple fact of direction, and then he wasn't in the hallway anymore. He was in Vernon's head. He didn't have a word for it. He was 5, and the vocabulary for what was happening to him simply did not exist in his framework of the world yet. But the sensation was immediate and complete, the way cold water is immediate and complete when you step into it, a sudden, total elsewhere. A different temperature. A different texture to the air, if air was even the right word for whatever this was. Vernon's thoughts were not neat. Harry would understand later, much later, what it meant that some minds had architecture and others had weather, and Vernon Dursley's mind was weather, warm fronts of self-satisfaction, cold snaps of contempt, the particular low-pressure system of a man who had never once in his life been asked to examine himself and had therefore accumulated things in the way a room accumulates clutter when nobody ever opens the windows. The feeling of the thoughts was thick. Heavy. Like wading through something warm and unpleasant. But there was something else here too, buried under the usual texture of Vernon's mind like an object beneath the surface of murky water. Harry didn't seek it out. He didn't know how to seek things out yet. He just fell toward it the way falling things fall, following the heaviest pull, the densest thing in the field. It was a memory. A kitchen. Not theirs, a different kitchen, older and darker, with a table that had a crack down one side. A man in a suit sitting across from Petunia with papers in front of him, and Petunia with her hands flat on the table, and her face arranged in a way Harry had never seen on her face before. Not her usual pinched disapproval. Something harder than that. Something with numbers in it. The man in the suit had a briefcase. Very ordinary. Very London. He was speaking in the tone of someone conducting business rather than having a conversation, and the words that came through to Harry were incomplete. It was Vernon's memory, after all, which meant it was filtered through Vernon's comprehension, which meant it had the texture of something overheard and not quite understood but retained anyway because certain numbers are large enough to be retained regardless. The arrangement, as previously discussed, will be maintained on a monthly basis. Discretion is, of course, expected from both parties. The boy must not be informed, not be coddled, not be given any particular reason to feel. A figure. Sterling. Monthly. Petunia's hands, flat on the table. Dumbledore's instructions are quite clear on this point. The boy is to remain. And here Vernon's memory blurred the way all memories blur at the edges of things that were embarrassing or confusing to the person who'd stored them, because Vernon had found out about this money obliquely, accidentally, had stumbled on a letter or a statement or overheard something he wasn't meant to hear, and had never quite known how to hold the information. He was not a man built for complexity. He had taken the money fact and stored it under something else, something that simplified it. They were being paid to put up with the boy, which confirmed what Vernon had always known, which was that the boy was a problem large enough to require compensation. But Harry, falling through the memory, caught something else. Something Vernon hadn't quite registered. A name. Said in the solicitor's careful, professional voice, attached to the money, attached to the instructions. A name Harry had never heard. Dumbledore. And a phrase, half dissolved in the blur of Vernon's imprecise recollection but still legible enough, still there, the child must not feel secure. Must not feel loved. The discomfort is, I'm afraid, a requirement of the arrangement. The hallway came back. Harry was hanging from Vernon's grip, blinking, and the sediment had all moved. Everything inside him had moved. Vernon was still talking. His mouth was still going. But his grip had loosened slightly, the way people's grips loosen when they've been ranting and run out of specific material and are coasting on general grievance, and Harry's feet were almost on the floor. Harry did not feel anything in particular. That was the interesting thing. He was 5 years old and he had just reached inside his uncle's head without knowing he was doing it and found something that rewrote the entire shape of his life, and he didn't feel afraid or sad or even very surprised. He felt very still. He felt the way the surface of water feels just before it freezes, all the motion happening below, invisible. Vernon dropped him. Harry caught himself on the wall, stayed on his feet. Vernon made a disgusted noise in the back of his throat and turned and walked away down the hall, already reaching up to loosen his tie further, already putting Harry behind him the way Vernon put everything that confused him behind him. Harry stood in the hall and looked at the wall and thought about the word Dumbledore. He didn't know what it meant yet. But he knew what it felt like in Vernon's memory. It felt like a transaction. It felt like a man at a table. It felt like his aunt's hands, flat, still, accepting, and a number that was large enough to make acceptance worth it. He went back to his cupboard. He closed the door. He sat down on the blanket. Outside, the rain was still going. Harry sat very still for a long time, and thought. He was 5. He had no framework for legilimency, no framework for the magical theory of memory and mind and the 1,000-year-old practice of mental intrusion. He had no framework for solicitors, for arrangement payments, for the complex and cold choreography of what Albus Dumbledore had constructed around number 4, Privet Drive. But he had a framework for the essential shape of the thing, because he was a child and children understand the essential shape of things even when they lack the vocabulary for the specifics. Someone was paying for this. Someone had decided that this, the cupboard, the too small food, the never enough warmth, the Dudleys' cast-offs, the freak and the boy and the not being loved, someone had decided all of this on purpose. It wasn't simply that Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon found him difficult, or that Dudley needed things they couldn't spare. Someone had arranged it. Someone had sat at a table with a solicitor and papers and explained that the boy must not feel secure, and that this was a requirement. Harry sat with this for a long time. He was 5. He cried sometimes, still, at night, when nobody could hear. Mostly he'd stopped. But he sat in the cupboard in the dark with the rain outside and the memory of Petunia's flat, still, accepting hands, and he thought he might cry now, not from sadness, exactly. More from something that didn't have a name yet, a feeling that you get when you've been told your whole short life that a thing is simply how things are, and then discover that someone built it that way deliberately. He didn't cry. He noticed that he didn't, the same way he noticed most things about himself, from a slight distance, observationally. He picked up the torn book with the red boat on the blue sea instead. He read it 3 more times, mechanically, and then the rain slowed outside and he heard the house settle into its nighttime sounds, and eventually he lay down on the blanket and looked at the ceiling of the cupboard, which was very close, and thought one specific thought until he fell asleep: I need to know more about what Dumbledore is. The next week at school, Harry asked his teacher if there was a place where you could find out about words. His teacher, a kind woman named Mrs. Albright, who had vaguely worried about Harry since September in the way that kind teachers worry about quiet, thin children who seem much more serious than they should be, told him that words could be found in dictionaries. Harry asked if they had one. They did. It was large and cloth-covered and lived on the shelf above the reading corner. Harry took it down during free period and found the D's. He couldn't find Dumbledore, which was a problem he filed away for later, but he found arrangement, and he found solicitor, and he sat cross-legged on the reading corner floor and read both entries twice and thought about their definitions in relation to what he'd seen. Arrangement, the action, process, or result of arranging or being arranged. A plan or preparation made for a future event. An agreement between 2 parties. Solicitor, a type of lawyer who prepares legal documents and gives legal advice. A lawyer. Someone had sent a lawyer to his aunt's kitchen to make an agreement. About him. About what his life was supposed to feel like. Mrs. Albright came to check on him after a while and found him sitting with the dictionary open on his lap, staring at nothing. "All right there, Harry," she asked. "What does requirement mean?" Harry asked. She told him. He nodded slowly. Right, he said, in a voice that made her feel, for a reason she couldn't quite articulate in the staff room later, as though she were talking to someone considerably older than 5. The day Harry came home from school to find Vernon in a good mood was harder, in a particular way, than the days Vernon was angry. Good mood Vernon was elaborately oblivious, expansive and loud and full of himself in a way that made him seem even larger than usual, filling the kitchen with his big opinions about people at work and television presenters and the neighbor's new car. He didn't look at Harry at all on good mood days, which was usually ideal, except that Harry had a question. He'd been turning the question over for the better part of 2 weeks, refining it, cutting away everything unnecessary the way you cut away fat from meat, and now he had it down to something small and precise. He waited until after dinner. Vernon was in his armchair watching the television news. Petunia was washing up. Dudley was upstairs making the kind of repetitive floor-rattling sounds that meant he was jumping on his bed again. Harry stood in the kitchen doorway. "Aunt Petunia," he said. She didn't turn around. The back of her neck, thin and pale above her collar, was the only signal she gave that she'd heard him. "Who paid you to take me in?" The washing up stopped. The silence was the particular kind that is shaped like a held breath. Petunia's hands were still in the soapy water. The television muttered on from the next room. Dudley thumped around upstairs. "Go to your room," Petunia said. Her voice was very controlled. Too controlled, the kind of control that takes significant effort. "I don't have a room," Harry said. "I have a cupboard." "Was that part of it? Not giving me a room?" "Harry." Her voice had gone sharp now. She turned. Her face was the wrong color, which was something Harry filed away without letting it change his expression. "You will go to your cupboard right now or I will tell Vernon," was the name Dumbledore? Harry asked. Her eyes went wide. Actually wide, Harry had never seen Aunt Petunia's eyes go wide before. They always went the other direction, narrowed, calculating. But they went wide now, and something moved behind them, something with the texture of the memory he'd seen in Vernon's head. Something with papers on a table in it. "Where did you hear that name?" she said. It wasn't quite a question either. "Was it him?" Harry asked. "Who sent the solicitor?" The color in Petunia's face had gone from wrong to genuinely absent. She looked, for the first time that Harry could remember, uncertain. And under the uncertainty, visible only because Harry was watching with the particular care of someone who had spent his whole life watching, something that looked almost like guilt. Almost. She straightened. The control came back, slammed down like a sash window. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said. "You're 5 years old." 5 and 2 months, Harry said. "And you didn't say no." From the sitting room, Vernon's chair creaked. They both heard it. Petunia turned back to the sink with the definitive movement of someone ending a conversation, and Harry looked at the rigid line of her back and understood that he would get nothing more from her tonight. But she hadn't said no. He went back to his cupboard. He sat down. He opened the torn book, didn't look at it, thought instead about the width of Petunia's eyes and the particular quality of the silence before she'd recovered herself. He knew what he'd seen in Vernon's head. Now he knew that Petunia knew what he'd seen. That meant it was real. Not a dream, not a misunderstanding, not a brain trick made of rain and thin blankets and going to bed hungry. Real. An agreement. A solicitor. Monthly. The word Dumbledore. He lay down. He stared at the ceiling, very close. He thought, "I need to find out what I can do." Because the thing that had happened in the hallway, the falling into Vernon's head, the seeing, that was the same category of strange as making things move without touching them, or the time he'd ended up on the school roof to escape Dudley and his gang, or the way hair that Petunia cut too short was always back to normal by morning. He'd been frightened of those things before. Or not frightened, exactly, careful. He'd been careful, because the reaction when those things happened was never good. Vernon's voice. Petunia's sharp inhalation. The cupboard, the no meals, the general atmosphere of punishment descending on the house like weather. But he wasn't as careful now as he had been this morning. Something had recalibrated. They were paid to do this to me, Harry thought, very clearly, in the dark. So I don't think I owe them my carefulness anymore. He was still 5 for another 10 months. The discovery of what he could do, truly, systematically, in the way that required patience and privacy and repetition, happened in stages over that time, the way all genuine learning happens, unevenly, with long plateaus, and then sudden lurching progress. The mental thing. The falling into people thing. He couldn't do it deliberately at first. It required the right kind of eye contact and the right kind of emotional state, which was frustrating because his emotional state was not something he could easily manufacture. But he noticed over the following weeks that it was easier when he was calm. Ironically, completely counterintuitively, the stiller he was inside, the easier it was to fall into the current of someone else. He was, by nature and necessity, good at being still. He practiced on Dudley first, because Dudley's mind was the least threatening place to be. It was loud in there, all immediate sensations and reflexive wants, not much architecture to speak of, but uncomplicated in a way that made it safe for practicing. Harry learned that he could slip in and out without Dudley ever noticing, because Dudley's attention was always entirely elsewhere, occupied with whatever was directly in front of him. He learned that he could go gently, or he could go the other way, with more force, with intention, with a push rather than a glide, but that the second method made his head ache afterward and tended to make the person he was pushing into confused and irritable without knowing why. He filed this away as a weapon of last resort. He practiced on Vernon's employees when they came to the house at Christmas, a charity thing, Vernon showing the neighborhood he was magnanimous, both of them knowing it. Harry circulated with a plate of Petunia's biscuits and looked into eyes when people reached for them and gathered information the way some children gather stones. This person was worried about money. This person was deeply, desperately bored. This person had done something and was carrying it everywhere. Information was the most useful thing. He had come to understand this very early, from watching and listening, but the mental thing transformed information gathering entirely. It was not invading, he told himself, because nobody had treated his mind as a private place worth protecting, and so he found it difficult to extend that courtesy automatically to others. It was, more than anything, useful. And he was committed to useful. The other things, the moving without touching, the appearing on rooftops, he was more measured about those. He'd seen Vernon's face after the roof incident. He'd felt the particular quality of Vernon's anger, which was the anger of a man who'd encountered something he didn't have categories for and needed to punish it until it stopped existing. Harry didn't stop doing those things. He just stopped doing them in front of anyone. He practiced in the garden at night, when the Dursleys were asleep. He practiced pulling leaves from the apple tree without touching them. He practiced making himself very small, not physically, but in some other sense, in the way that prey animals are still and quiet and below notice, and found that he could make himself genuinely difficult to look at, in the same way you don't look at lampposts or postboxes, just an object you navigate around without registering. This last skill, he thought, was the most immediately practical. In 6 months he had a fairly reliable picture of his abilities. They were not unlimited. They cost something, concentration, which cost energy, which cost food, which meant the Dursley's habit of limiting his meals had a second, more specific cruelty to it. He ate more deliberately after that, hoarding food from meals when he could, supplementing with anything he could find. He was meticulous about it. He was meticulous about everything now. He turned 6 in July. Nobody acknowledged it. He sat in the garden in the sun and ate half a biscuit he'd kept in his sock and thought about a name. Dumbledore. He still didn't know enough. He could see, from the shape of what he'd found in Vernon's memory, the outline of something large, something that involved lawyers and money and specific instructions about how a child should be raised, and something called a prophecy that had appeared in the dream he'd had after the hallway incident, though that one was harder to credit because dreams were unreliable. But the outline wasn't enough. He needed substance. He needed to find out where this information lived and how to get to it. He needed to know what he was. Because the word Dumbledore lived in Vernon's memory alongside other words, half dissolved, partially recovered, and one of those words was wizard, and another was magic, and when Harry sat in the garden and made a leaf turn over without touching it, he already had a sense that these words were not separate things. He thought about Dumbledore, the man who'd sent a solicitor to his aunt's kitchen, who'd put money on the table and arranged, in writing, that Harry must not feel secure. Must not feel loved. He thought about what kind of man would do that, and why. He thought about the word requirement. The discomfort is a requirement. Some part of it made a bleak kind of sense, in the way that horrible logic makes sense when you look at it honestly. If you needed someone to be a certain shape, and they were not yet that shape, you would need to do certain things to make them that shape. You would need to hollow them out. You would need to make sure they had nothing, no warmth, no certainty, no sense of their own solidity, so that when you offered them something, anything, they would take it with both hands and never ask questions. Harry was 6 years old and sitting in the garden with the sun on his face and half a stolen biscuit, and he understood that Dumbledore, whoever he was, had intended to make Harry into someone who would take anything offered and never ask questions. He took a small, careful bite of the biscuit. He found, examining himself, that he was not that person. He found, more precisely, that he had never been that person, and that Vernon shaking him in the hallway had merely made that fact visible. He finished the biscuit. He watched the leaf turn in the still air, moved by nothing but his own attention. He thought about what he needed to know and how long it would take to get there and what he would do when he had it. He was not afraid. He was, he realized, quite patient. Patience was another thing the Dursleys had given him by accident, not as a gift but as a necessity, the way difficult environments give children things they'd never have needed otherwise. He could wait. He was very good at waiting. He would wait, and learn, and accumulate what he needed. And when he had enough, he would find Albus Dumbledore. Not to confront him. Not yet. He was 6. He was realistic about what 6 could accomplish. But eventually. On his own terms, with his own information, holding everything the man had thought he'd buried. Harry looked at the leaf turning in the still garden air and thought, you arranged this. You paid for this. You planned what I was supposed to become. He let the leaf settle. I'm going to be something else. That night he lay in his cupboard and listened to the house breathe around him and thought about the word that kept surfacing in the recovered edges of Vernon's memory, blurred and only partially intact but there, persistently there, prophecy. He didn't know what it meant in this context. He'd looked it up in the school dictionary, a prediction of what will happen in the future, especially one made by someone with divine or magical authority. Someone had predicted something. About him, he thought. It had something to do with why he mattered enough to arrange, why Dumbledore had sat a lawyer in Petunia's kitchen and put money on the table. You didn't do that for a child you didn't need for something. He stored the word carefully in the part of himself where important unresolved things lived. Then he closed his eyes, and the rain started again outside, and number 4, Privet Drive was quiet around him, all its people sleeping, none of them knowing what the smallest of them was thinking about in the dark. He was 5 years and 10 months old. He was already different from what he was supposed to be. And the crack in the wall, the one Vernon had made without meaning to, shaking him in the hallway in fury and losing something out of his head that he should have kept, was only getting wider. Chapter 2, Small Wars. The library was on Magnolia Road. Harry had walked past it 40 or 50 times without going in, because going in required not being noticed, and for the first year of his life at Privet Drive he had still been working out how to do that reliably. But by the autumn after the hallway incident, he had the not being noticed thing down to something close to a science, and so one Tuesday afternoon when Dudley's gang were occupying the park and the weather was too grey to make the garden useful, Harry pushed open the library door and went inside. The smell hit him first. Old paper and carpet cleaner and something underneath both of those things that he didn't have a word for yet but would later identify as simply books, the particular atmosphere of a room where a large number of them lived together, breathing quietly. He stood inside the door for a moment and looked around. A woman at the front desk was helping someone with a form. Two elderly men sat in armchairs near the window with newspapers. A child Harry didn't know from school was in the children's section, and Harry angled away from her automatically, keeping a shelf between them, old habit. He went to the reference section. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, but he'd learned that the reference section was where you went when you had a category rather than a specific title, and what he had was categories. History. Unusual things. The kind of knowledge that didn't turn up in school. He pulled out a book called A History of British Folklore and sat down on the floor behind the shelf. Nobody sat on the floor in the reference section, which meant nobody would come looking for him there, and opened it to the index. He looked up Wizard. 11 entries. He read all of them. They were mostly useless, folk stories, superstition, medieval persecution. But two of them had something in common, the consistent, recurring suggestion that the people being described were real. Not metaphorically real, not symbolically real. People who had genuinely done things that the writers of history, embarrassed and rationalizing, had been unable to convincingly explain away. He returned A History of British Folklore and pulled out 3 more books. By the time the library closed at 5 o'clock, he had a working hypothesis. He walked home in the gray autumn afternoon, thinking. The thing about hypotheses was that they needed testing. Harry had one main piece of evidence and one main working theory. The evidence was what he'd seen in Vernon's head, the solicitor, the money, the name, the words wizard and magic and the smeared impression of prophecy. The theory was that these things were real, actually, physically real, a real world overlapping this one, and that he was part of it, and that Dumbledore was someone significant within it who had decided to keep Harry isolated from it until whatever the prophecy required of him came due. What he needed was a second data point. Something independent. He found it in himself, which in retrospect was the obvious place to look. He spent 3 weeks running very deliberate experiments in the garden at night and in his cupboard during the day. He was methodical about it in the way that felt natural to him. Try a thing, observe the result, adjust the variable, repeat. He found that he could move objects reliably up to about his own body weight, though heavier things made his temples ache. He found that the not being noticed thing worked best when he wanted it to and poorly when he was agitated, which meant it was connected to his emotional state in some way he didn't fully understand yet. He found that the falling into people thing had a range, he had to be within arm's length, and direct eye contact helped significantly. He also found a fourth thing, which was new and which he treated with particular care. He was doing the dishes, one of his regular duties, along with cooking breakfast and most of the garden work, when he dropped a plate. It was Petunia's good china, the set she brought out for company, and it fell from his soapy hands and tumbled toward the tile floor and Harry, without thinking, without any deliberate intention, said stop. Not out loud. Inside. A word that wasn't a word, more like the idea of stopping deployed with absolute conviction. The plate stopped. It hung in the air 8 inches above the floor, spinning slowly, and Harry looked at it, and the kitchen was very quiet, and then he reached out and took it from the air and finished washing it and set it in the rack with hands that were only slightly unsteady. He stood at the sink for a long moment. Then he thought, very carefully, that is useful. He practiced that one in his cupboard, where he could control the environment entirely. Small objects first, the button he'd found in the garden, a marble Dudley had lost under the refrigerator and Harry had quietly recovered, the stub of pencil he used for his homework. He could hold them suspended as long as his concentration held, which was currently about 4 minutes before the headache started. He was not afraid of any of it. He had made the decision not to be afraid quite deliberately, the same way he'd made the decision about the carefulness. Fear was a thing other people had intended him to feel about himself. He declined. 6 years old became 7, and 7 had its own texture. He was taller. Not by much, the Desley's food management kept him thin and smaller than his classmates, which he was aware was another piece of the arrangement, another requirement maintained, but his mind was moving faster than his body, which was frustrating in specific practical ways. He needed information he couldn't get from the Magnolia Road Library. He had read, by now, everything the folklore section held that was remotely relevant. He'd read 2 full encyclopedias, selectively. He'd read a book about the history of medicine that had a chapter on historical practices that sounded, when read carefully, extremely similar to what he could do. He'd read a children's book about mythology that was clearly written by someone who knew more than they were saying. None of it had given him a second data point the way he needed. None of it had given him Dumbledore, the man specifically, his role, his power, the structure of the world he apparently presided over. What he needed was someone from that world. But he was 7, and his movements were not precisely his own: school, house, garden, library on Tuesdays. He didn't have money. He didn't have access to much beyond Privet Drive and its immediate surroundings. He had, however, been watching the neighborhood for 2 years with the patient, accumulative attention of someone who has learned that watching is the most powerful tool available to him. And he had noticed something in late October of that year that he hadn't known how to categorize. Mrs. Fig, at number 7. She was old. She smelled of cats and cooked cabbage. She'd looked after Harry on 2 occasions when the Dursleys went somewhere they didn't wish to take him, and she had been neither cruel nor warm during these visits, just neutrally present, which in Harry's experience made her unusual among adults. She'd let him sit in her sitting room and look at her photo albums, which were full of cats. She'd given him biscuits, real ones, without being asked. But here was the thing about Mrs. Fig that Harry had noticed on his second visit, in the way you notice something that your mind has filed without telling you until it surfaces later. Her sitting room had a smell underneath the cats and the cabbage. Not strong. Very faint, like something kept in a cupboard most of the time. A smell Harry could only describe to himself as like when I do the big things, the plate stopping, the roof landing, the most energetic of his garden experiments. A mineral, charged quality to the air, specific and familiar. He'd sat in her sitting room and smelled it and not known what to do with the information. He sat with it for 6 months before he did anything. Then one Thursday in November, when the sky was low and purple-gray and Dudley had broken his toy car and was consequently making the house untenable, Harry knocked on Mrs. Fig's door. She answered promptly, looked at him, and looked over his shoulder at the Dursley house with an expression that was complex enough to be interesting. "Harry," she said. "Your aunt sent you?" "No," he said. "I came on my own." She looked at him for a moment. "Well," she said. "Come in then. I'll put the kettle on." He didn't ask her directly. He was 7, not an idiot. Direct questions to adults you didn't yet trust were inefficient at best and counterproductive at worst. Instead he sat in her sitting room with a cup of tea that was mostly milk and ate 2 biscuits and talked about her cats with genuine interest, because cats were interesting, and watched her. She was watching him back. He could see it, the quality of her attention beneath the surface of the ordinary old woman performance. Something careful in the way her eyes moved to him when she thought he wasn't looking. Something alert. He let his attention rest on her face in the particular way, not forcing anything, just open. Receptive. The edge of something moved through him. Not a full picture this time. She was paying attention to herself in a way Vernon never had been, and it was harder to find footing in a mind that was watching its own perimeter. But he caught the texture of it. Fear. Not of him, not exactly. Fear about him. A thread of it running through everything, wound around a specific worry that pulsed at the center of her attention like a second heartbeat. And woven through the fear, like a name engraved on the inside of a ring, Dumbledore. Harry looked at his tea. So she's one of his. The thought arrived quietly, without heat. She's here watching me. That's why she's in this neighborhood. That's why she takes me when the Dursleys go out, she reports back. He wasn't surprised. He was 7 and he'd been building his picture of the world for 2 years with very limited materials, but the picture had a consistent shape. Dumbledore had arranged things carefully, thoroughly, with multiple overlapping systems. Of course there was a watcher on the street. Of course the kindest person in the neighborhood was part of the architecture. He sipped his tea. "Do you know what I can do?" he asked. Mrs. Fig went very still. "I'm not sure I know what you mean," she said, in a voice that was careful in the way of someone choosing every word individually. "I think you do," Harry said pleasantly. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. I just thought it might be more efficient." She looked at him, really looked at him, the careful performance dropping briefly away, and what was on her face then was something close to shock and something close to guilt and something close to pity, but the pity was complicated by what looked like respect. "You're 7 years old," she said. "Yes," Harry agreed. She set her teacup down. She pressed her lips together. He could see her running calculations, weighing things. "I'm not supposed to discuss it," she said finally. "I know," Harry said. "Dumbledore told you not to." The name in her face was like dropping something heavy into still water, the ripple was immediate and total. Both of them felt it. "Where did you hear that name?" she said, and it was the same question Petunia had asked in the same voice, and Harry thought that said something interesting about what the name did to people who were connected to it. "I have good ears," Harry said, which was technically true. Mrs. Fig studied him for a very long time. The cat on the footstool, a large orange animal called Mr. Tibbles, according to the introductions at the start of the visit, stretched and resettled. The radiator ticked. "I can't tell you things," she said at last, and the guilt in her voice was so unguarded that Harry felt it without any deliberate reaching, just the natural warmth of it. There are things I'm bound not to discuss with you. It's not, I want you to know it's not because I think you couldn't understand." "I know," Harry said, and meant it. "But you could tell me if I was safe." She blinked. "You are safe," she said quickly. "You're absolutely safe, you're protected, in this house?" Harry asked. The guilt flared again, immediate and searing. He saw her see his face and saw her understand that her face had already answered the question. "Harry, it's all right," he said. He put his teacup down and stood up, straightening his oversized jumper, Dudley's cast-off, 3 years old and already threadbare. "I'm not angry at you. I just needed to know which parts of it were real and which parts were the story." "Which parts of what?" she asked, though he could see she already half knew. "The arrangement," he said. He thanked her for the tea and the biscuits. He said goodbye to Mr. Tibbles, who regarded him with yellow eyes that were slightly more intelligent than seemed warranted. He left, and walked back to number 4 in the grey November afternoon, and thought about what he had and what he still needed. She'd confirmed it. Not directly, she was too careful for directly, too bound to Dumbledore's instructions. But she'd confirmed it in the only way that actually mattered, she hadn't denied it. And her face had said the rest. He was protected, she'd said. Protected. Not cared for. Not loved. Not safe. Protected. Like an asset. Like something you put a lock on because you need it later. Harry walked up the Privet Drive and thought about the difference between protection and care, and found that the difference was, in fact, everything. The winter was harder than usual. Not the weather, he didn't mind the cold much, having grown up in the cupboard, which was cold 6 months of the year because the house's heating didn't extend to it. The cold he'd made peace with early. It was the quality of the Dursleys' attention that was harder this winter, and he thought it was because of what he'd said to Petunia in October, the question about who'd paid them. She'd recovered herself quickly, Petunia, she was good at that, but she was watching him differently now, with something brittle in it, and Vernon, who was constitutionally incapable of sustained subtlety, kept finding reasons to assert himself in Harry's direction. Reminders of smallness. Reminders of the hierarchy. Harry endured them with a patience that was genuinely unrattled, which only seemed to infuriate Vernon more. He'd found something useful, the infuriation itself was information. If he was supposed to be afraid of Vernon, if the whole arrangement depended on Harry being afraid, or at least performing fear convincingly, then his failure to be sufficiently afraid was itself a small act of war. He didn't rub it in. He was too strategic for that. He kept his face neutral, his body language appropriately small, his silences unreadable. But underneath the performance, he was steady in a way that hadn't existed before the hallway. The crack Vernon had made had let something in, or let something out. Harry wasn't always sure which way to frame it, and whatever it was structural now. It held him up from the inside. He spent the winter reading and practicing and going to Mrs. Figg's on occasional Thursdays. She didn't give him information. But she gave him biscuits and let him sit in her warm sitting room and treated him as though his thoughts were worth taking seriously, and these were not trivial gifts. He was careful not to push into her mind again. She'd been kind, and he'd decided that kindness was one of the few things he reciprocated with restraint. But he paid attention to everything she said and didn't say, and catalogued it, and built a picture out of the shape of her silences. He learned that the magical world had a government. He learned that it had schools. He learned, from the way she almost flinched at certain topics, that the world had recently experienced something violent enough to leave everyone who'd lived through it permanently altered. He learned that Dumbledore was extremely powerful within that world structure, not just respected, but central, the kind of presence that organized other people's lives without their necessarily being aware of it. He thought about what it meant to be central in that way, and how much of being central was about information management. Controlling what people knew, and when they knew it, and how it was framed when they found out. He was 7, and he was already thinking about this clearly enough to understand that Dumbledore's greatest advantage was simply that Harry wasn't supposed to know what he knew. The whole construction, the cupboard, the Dursleys, the isolation, the squib neighbor watching the street, it all depended on Harry arriving at the magical world at 11 years old, overwhelmed and grateful and with no context. Harry sat in Mrs. Figg's warm sitting room with Mr. Tibbles on the footstool and a biscuit in his hand and thought, so context is the weapon. He needed more of it. He needed the kind of information that Mrs. Figg couldn't give him, specific, detailed, structural. He needed to know what a Potter was, in the world he was supposed to belong to. He needed to know what had been done with his parents' estate, because the solicitor in Vernon's memory had mentioned money and the word vault, and Harry had thought about this for 2 years without being able to do anything about it because he was 7 and had no money and no access to the city. He needed to get to London. He began, with the same patient methodology he brought to everything, to work out how. The school year turned. January grey became February grey became March grey and then suddenly April arrived with genuine warmth and the library on Tuesdays started to smell less like old carpet and more like cut grass from the propped open window. Harry found the book in the library's local history section on a Tuesday in April, sandwiched between a directory of Surrey businesses and something about the history of the local council. It wasn't a magical book. It was an entirely ordinary book about the history of London banking, and it was there because it was a library and libraries keep things because that's their nature, and the reason Harry pulled it off the shelf was because the cover had a building on it that looked familiar in a way he couldn't immediately explain. He opened it. Read the section on private banking institutions. Found a paragraph that made him read it twice, very carefully. Gringotts, situated in Diagon, in the older financial district, established in. The text was clearly printed but something around the specific location made his eyes want to slide away, which was interesting. He forced them back. The building on the cover was white marble. The book said it was the most secure banking institution in the country, and that it was staffed primarily by goblins, said the book, with the absolute matter-of-factness of a text that didn't think this required explanation. Harry sat down on the floor behind the reference shelf. Gringotts, he thought. A bank. Vaults. His uncle's memory had said the word vault. Petunia had not denied that there was money involved. He had a place, now. He had a name. He had, for the first time, something concrete and locatable. He put the book back. He walked home. He calculated. The fare from Surrey to London by coach was approximately £3.50. He had saved, over the course of 7 months from dinner pennies and twice finding money in Dudley's discarded trousers before washing them, approximately £1.83. He needed another £1.67, and a day when nobody would notice he was gone long enough to matter. He was patient. He had established that. He went home and cooked dinner and ate the smaller portion and listened to Vernon hold forth about something on the news and did not say anything and thought, under all of it, with a steady hum, soon. May brought two things, a warm spell that put Vernon in an expansive mood, and Dudley's birthday, which put the entire household into a particular state of organized chaos that Harry had learned to work with. On Dudley's birthday, Harry was generally invisible by design. Petunia and Vernon's attention was entirely consumed by the production of making Dudley feel adequately celebrated, which required significant coordinating, and Harry was expected to keep out of the way and make himself small, which suited him perfectly. He spent the morning in the garden cleaning up after a birthday party he hadn't been invited to, which involved a great deal of wrapping paper and a quantity of cake that had been distributed onto the lawn by enthusiastic small boys. He collected the wrapping paper and put it in the bin and pocketed a 10-pence coin that had fallen out of one of Dudley's birthday cards during the tearing open process. And then, at 1:30, while the Dursley household was occupied with Dudley's birthday film and Vernon's 3 o'clock nap and Petunia's telephonic account of the party to her friend Yvonne, while the house was as predictably busy as it ever got, Harry walked out the back garden gate, down the alley behind Privet Drive, and didn't come back. He got the coach from the stop on the main road, paid his £2.10 with the exact change he'd been keeping in a sock for 3 months, and sat in the window seat and watched Surrey give way to the outskirts of London and thought about what he was going to say when he got there. Because the question was not just how to find Gringotts. Based on the local history book's odd, slippery prose, Gringotts was not exactly visible to everyone. It was in a district that the text had trouble naming. Harry had thought about this and concluded that the magical world had managed, somehow, to make itself adjacent to rather than simply located within the ordinary one, and that getting to it probably required either knowledge he didn't have or a method he'd need to improvise. He had a plan for improvisation. He got off the coach in central London and walked toward the financial district and opened his attention in the particular way he'd been practicing, not looking for anything specific, just receptive. Listening to the texture of the city. Most cities, he would later understand, don't have a magical district. London did because London was very old, and old cities accumulate things. He found it within 40 minutes, not because he could see it but because he could feel the way his attention wanted to slide away from a particular alley off Charing Cross Road, and that wanting to slide was by now a familiar sensation. He knew how to stop his eyes from sliding. He pushed through the slide, looked at the alley, and saw what was actually there. The leaky cauldron was dim and old and smelled like things Harry didn't have names for yet. He was 7, alone, in his Dudley cast-off too large jeans and his too large grey jumper, and he walked through the door with the same unhurried certainty with which he did most things now, and the barman, a man so wrinkled he appeared to have melted slightly, looked up and went utterly still. "Can I help you?" the barman asked, in the voice of someone for whom this question had arrived considerably earlier in the situation than expected. "I need to get to Gringotts," Harry said. "Please." The barman stared at him. Harry met his eyes and waited. "Your son, the man leaned forward. Squinted. Looked at Harry's forehead, where the fringe of his too long hair was pushed back from the heat of the coach. "You're not, are you Harry Potter?" "Yes," Harry said. The barman made a sound. Then he came around from behind the bar with the sort of urgency usually reserved for emergencies, and 3 people at nearby tables looked up, and Harry thought very quickly and deliberately made himself slightly less interesting to look at, not invisible, just, unremarkable, ordinary, just a child passing through, and most of the gazes slid away. "I just need the way to Gringotts," Harry said to the barman. "I know how to knock the bricks." He didn't. But the barman, convinced by Harry's certainty and rattled by his presence and not quite able to reconcile the very small child in front of him with the category of significant person requiring management, walked Harry to the back courtyard and showed him. Harry watched very carefully and memorized every tap. "Thank you," he said, and stepped through when the archway appeared. Diagon Alley opened in front of him. He stopped for exactly 3 seconds and looked at it, the color of it, the texture, the way it smelled entirely unlike Surrey or London or anything he'd encountered before. The noise of it, the movement, the robes and the barrels and the owl somewhere overhead. Then he straightened his jumper and walked toward the white building at the far end. He was 7 years old and he had saved £1.83 and found another 10 on Dudley's birthday and taken a coach alone to London and found a hidden magical street by feeling where his attention didn't want to go. He walked into Gringotts and told the goblin at the nearest desk that he needed to discuss the Potter accounts, and when the goblin looked up with professional, assessing skepticism, Harry looked at him with the steady and entirely genuine certainty of someone who has never in his life been told they were allowed to be here but has decided to be here anyway. The goblin said, "Do you have identification?" Harry said, "I have my scar." A pause. "One moment," the goblin said, and stood up. He didn't get everything he'd come for. He was 7, and even in the magical world, 7 was 7. But he sat in a small office with a goblin called Ragnarok while 2 other goblins checked something in a ledger, and the information that passed across that desk was enough. There were Potter vaults. Plural. There was a trust vault, set up for Harry's school expenses from age 11. There was the main vault, which contained the whole of the Potter estate. And there was a third vault, smaller, separate, and flagged with a notation in the ledger that made Ragnarok pause when he saw it. He turned the ledger away from Harry, which was telling. "There's something you're not showing me," Harry said. Ragnarok looked at him with black, reflective eyes. "There is a sealed instruction attached to one of your holdings," he said carefully. "Sealed by a third party at the time of your parents' deaths. It cannot be accessed until your 11th birthday." "Who sealed it?" Harry asked. Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. "I cannot disclose that information," he said. And then, with the particular precision of a goblin who respected the letter of his constraints while finding certain interpretations of them satisfying, "However, I can tell you that it was not your parents." Harry sat with this. "Is there anything else I'm allowed to know?" he asked. Ragnarok looked at the ledger again. "There are standing payment instructions from the trust vault," he said. "Disbursements made monthly. To a property on Privet Drive in Surrey." He said it without any editorial comment. His face was absolutely neutral. But he met Harry's eyes when he said it, and Harry held the contact, and what passed between them in that moment was too specific to be accidental. "How long?" Harry asked. "Since the month after your arrival there," Ragnarok said. "November 1981. Harry did the arithmetic. 5.5 years. Monthly. From his vault, his parents' money, to Petunia's household. The payment wasn't just from Dumbledore to Petunia as an external party. It was structured as if it were an estate maintenance fee. As if Harry's own inheritance were funding his own mistreatment. He looked at the desk surface for a moment. Then he looked up. "Thank you," he said. "I'll be back when I'm 11. Ragnarok looked at him. Something shifted in his expression, too small to be a smile, but in the direction of something approving. "The Potter vaults will be ready," he said. Harry stood and straightened his jumper and walked back through the marble hall of Gringotts and out into the noise and color of Diagon Alley. He stood on the steps in the afternoon sun for a moment and breathed through his nose. His own money. His parents' money, paying Petunia monthly to keep him small. Dumbledore had not just paid Petunia, he'd structured it so the payment came from Harry himself, which was elegant and terrible in the way that truly awful things sometimes were. He walked back through the alley. Back through the cauldron. Back to the coach stop. Back to Surrey. He got home at 5:30, slipped back through the garden gate, and was in the garden collecting the last of the birthday wrapping paper when Petunia came out to call him for the washing up, and she didn't notice he'd been gone. He washed up in silence and thought about November 1981 and a goblin's careful eyes and money moving from his dead parents' vault into the house that kept him in a cupboard. He thought about patience. He thought about time. He thought about what he'd do, at 11, when the sealed letter in the third vault became accessible. He was 7 years old and he had 2 more years of this, the small food and the cupboard and the arrangements daily requirement of his own diminishment, and he was, in the particular way of someone who has decided their suffering is no longer incidental but purposeful, entirely fine. He was fine because he was counting. The small wars of Privet Drive, the dinners withheld, the insults distributed, the cupboard and the too large clothes and the grinding daily machinery of being minimized, they were still happening, still real, still sharp. He wasn't numb to them. He felt them. He just felt them the way you feel weather when you know you're going inside soon. He put the last of the plates away and dried his hands and looked out the kitchen window at the garden going golden in the early evening, and thought of Ragnar's careful, deliberate, entirely deniable disclosure, and the goblin's eyes meeting his when the information landed. The Potter vaults will be ready. So will I, Harry thought. So will I. Chapter 3, The Visit. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Harry knew it was coming before it came, the way you sometimes know weather before the sky changes, a specific pressure in the air, a quality to the morning that was different without being obviously different. He was 7 3 months, and he'd been watching Mrs. Figg's house more carefully than usual since his visit to Gringotts, because he'd understood, coming home on the coach from London with his Dudley jeans and his new information, that he'd done something visible. He'd walked into Gringotts and talked to goblins and stood in Diagon Alley in broad afternoon light, and the magical world was not, apparently, a world that missed things like that. So he watched Mrs. Figg's curtains and waited. The letter came 3 weeks after the Gringotts visit, on a cool Wednesday morning in June, and it didn't come by post. It came by owl. Harry was in the garden pulling weeds when the bird landed on the fence post nearest him, a serious-looking tawny owl with a sealed envelope in its beak and the posture of something that had been given precise instructions and intended to follow them. It looked at Harry. Harry looked at it. The owl extended its leg. Harry took the letter. It wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. V. Dursley, in a precise, institutional hand, with a purple wax seal that had an H on it. Harry turned it over. Looked at the seal. Looked at the owl, which was already lifting away, having fulfilled its function. He stood in the garden with the letter in his hand and thought about this for exactly 4 seconds. Then he opened it. He was 7. He had been funding his own misery from his dead parents' money for 5.5 years. He opened the letter. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, this letter serves as routine notification from the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry regarding the upcoming magical education of Harry James Potter, currently resident at your address. Our records indicate that Harry will be of enrolling age in approximately 4 years. In accordance with standard Ministry of Magic protocol for underage magicals residing in non-magical households, we conduct periodic welfare assessments to ensure the child's development is proceeding satisfactorily. A representative from the Ministry's Office of Underage Magical Affairs will visit your home on Friday, June 14th, between the hours of 2 and 4 in the afternoon. This visit is routine and non-compulsory, but failure to cooperate with Ministry representatives may result in further inquiry. We look forward to welcoming Harry to Hogwarts in due course. Yours sincerely, Albus P.W.B. Dumbledore Headmaster, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Order of Merlin, First Class, etc. Harry read it twice. Routine welfare assessment. He held the phrase up and looked at it from both sides. If the welfare assessments were routine, they'd been happening before, and if they'd been happening before, then either Dumbledore had been receiving satisfactory reports from whoever conducted them, or the reports had been managed in the same way Mrs. Figg managed things, which was to say through very careful omissions. He folded the letter precisely and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope on the kitchen table where Petunia would find it. Then he went back to the garden and pulled weeds and thought about Friday. Petunia found the letter at 9:30 and was on the telephone within 30 seconds. Harry, crouched beneath the kitchen window trimming the hedge, heard her voice going through the registers of controlled panic, the tight high note she hit when something threatened the surface of things, the particular clipped efficiency she deployed when she was managing rather than feeling. Vernon's voice, from the hall, "What's that?" Petunia's voice, muffled but clear enough, "Hogwarts letter. Ministry visit. Friday." We need to have the house looking. Vernon said something Harry didn't catch. Petunia, he'll need to be presentable. Dudley's blue jumper. Harry filed this away. He was going to be dressed up for the ministry representative. He was going to be presented as a child in reasonable condition. He thought about the cupboard and the too small food and the months of Mrs. Figg's gilt-weighted silence and the sealed vault at Gringotts and the word requirement in a solicitor's voice. He was going to be dressed in Dudley's blue jumper and presented as fine. He straightened up from the hedge and looked at the garden and thought, no. We're not doing that. Wednesday and Thursday he spent in preparation. His preparation was not dramatic. He didn't rehearse speeches or plan confrontations. He thought. He mapped out the likely shape of the visit, who would come, what they would look for, what questions they'd ask, who had instructed them and how much those instructions would have shaped what they expected to find. He thought about the ministry representative as a reader of a report rather than an observer of a situation, and about the difference between those two things. He also went to the library on Thursday afternoon and spent 2 hours reading everything he could find about legal processes involving children's welfare, which turned out to be a great deal more than he'd expected and a great deal more specific than he'd hoped. He found what he was looking for in a thin pamphlet about children's rights that lived in the civics section, read it carefully, and memorized the parts that were relevant. Thursday night he sat in his cupboard and considered his options. He could be quiet. He could wear Dudley's blue jumper and sit in the sitting room and be the kind of unremarkable that made ministry representatives tick their boxes and move on. This was the safe option, the one with the lowest immediate cost. It was also the option that changed nothing. Or he could be specific. He could be precise and calm and say exactly the right things to the right person in the right sequence, and possibly change something. He thought about the letter. Routine welfare assessment. He thought about all the routine welfare assessments that had presumably happened before, that had found everything satisfactory, that had allowed the arrangement to continue. He thought about what Dumbledore had intended to produce, an 11-year-old arriving at the magical world knowing nothing, having nothing, owed nothing. He thought about how far along that project currently was, and whether it was reversible, and whether Friday was a door. He decided it was a door. He lay down on his blanket. He slept well, which he'd also learned to do on purpose. The ministry representative arrived at 2:20 on Friday afternoon, which was late enough that Petunia had been visibly strung tight for 20 minutes in the sitting room. Vernon had taken the afternoon off work, which Harry knew had cost him something in pride, and sat in his armchair with the particular rigidity of a man who has been told to seem relaxed and has no experience with the instruction. Dudley had been sent to a friend's house. Harry was on the sofa in Dudley's blue jumper. The representative was a woman. Late 30s, sharp-faced, with a briefcase and the manner of someone who conducted this kind of visit often enough to have routinized it. She had short brown hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head and a ministry badge that read Millicent Bramley, Office of Underage Magical Affairs. She shook hands with Vernon, who was effusive in a way that made Harry's teeth ache, and with Petunia, who was gracious and precisely warm in the manner she deployed for company. Then she looked at Harry. "Hello," she said. "You must be Harry." "Yes," Harry said. "It's nice to meet you." She smiled in the practiced way of someone who conducted interviews with children regularly, and Harry smiled back and made himself slightly more open-seeming, slightly more eager, the way adults expected children to be when presented with official attention. It was a very specific performance and he'd been observing children who performed it naturally for 2 years. She sat in the armchair across from the sofa. Opened her briefcase. Produced a file. "I won't take too much of your time," she said to Vernon and Petunia in the tone that meant this was a formality that would be completed and filed and forgotten. "Just a few routine questions." "Harry," she turned back to him, "do you like it here?" "At home, at school." "School is fine," Harry said. "I like the library." She made a note. Her pen moved with the brisk efficiency of someone filling in a form rather than recording a genuine observation. Harry watched the pen. "And at home? Do you have everything you need?" From the armchair, Vernon made an expansive noise that wasn't quite a word, a sound that meant of course, we're very generous without committing to the specific claim. Harry looked at Millicent Bramley. He looked at her directly, with exactly the right amount of attention, not staring, not shy, just present. I sleep in the cupboard under the stairs, he said. The pen stopped. Petunia's head turned toward him. Not dramatically, a small, controlled movement, the head movement of someone recalibrating. Vernon's hands, folded on his stomach, shifted. Millicent Bramley looked up from her clipboard. I'm sorry, she said. The cupboard under the stairs, Harry said, in the same pleasant, conversational tone. I sleep there. There's a cot and a blanket. You can see it if you like, the door's in the hall. Silence. It was, Harry thought, a very specific kind of silence, the kind that has a shape to it. The shape of something landing that everyone in the room had hoped would not land. Millicent Bramley looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Vernon and Petunia, and her face had changed into something much more awake than it had been when she arrived. Is that true? She asked. And there was something in her voice now, something with edges. Vernon began to explain. Petunia began to explain alongside him, their voices overlapping in the practiced way of people who have prepared explanations and are now deploying them simultaneously, which had the predictable effect of making the explanations sound more constructed than they would have alone. The story, as it emerged from the tangle, was, the room was used for storage, Harry had expressed a preference, it was temporary, there were plans to redecorate the box room's full of Dudley's broken toys, Harry said helpfully. There's a list, if it would help. I can remember most of them. Millicent Bramley was writing rapidly now. Her pen had found a different gear entirely. How long have you been sleeping in the cupboard? She asked Harry. Since I came here, Harry said. November 1981. I was 15 months old. Vernon said, very loudly, now just a minute, Vernon, Petunia said. One word. He stopped. Millicent Bramley looked at Petunia. Something was happening between them, an adult communication that moved through the air without language, something about how much both of them understood about what was actually happening here. Mrs. Dursley, she said. Perhaps you could show me of course, Petunia said. Precisely. Controlled. She stood, and smoothed her skirt, and led the ministry representative into the hall. Harry sat on the sofa. Vernon looked at him. Harry looked back. He didn't make his face defiant or triumphant or afraid. He made his face a child's face, open, a little uncertain, the kind of face that reads as innocent rather than strategic. He was very good at this face by now. He'd had substantial practice. Vernon's was the color of the particular brick that gets very dark in rain, and his hands had gripped the arms of the chair, and Harry could see him doing the arithmetic on the situation, the ministry woman in the hall, the clipboard, the notes, and arriving at the conclusion that there was nothing useful he could do in the next 30 seconds except sit there, which was correct. Harry heard Millicent Bramley open the cupboard door. A pause. He heard Petunia's voice, very quiet, saying something he couldn't make out. Then Millicent Bramley came back into the sitting room alone. She sat down. She wrote something else. She was using a great deal more of the page than she had been 10 minutes ago. Harry, she said, and her voice had gone quiet in a way that was different from professional quiet. More careful. Is there anything else you want to tell me about? And here Harry thought, because there was quite a lot else, the food, the too small clothing, the freak and boy and the not being included in anything, and he was 7 and this was a door and he could push it open further. But he was also, even at 7, already thinking 3 moves ahead. If he pushed this door open all the way, if he told her everything, in the specific and credible detail he could provide, then what happened next would be determined by the ministry. By Dumbledore's ministry, the one that had apparently been sending routine representatives to tick boxes and file reports and find everything satisfactory for 5.5 years. Whatever change happened would happen inside that system, which meant Dumbledore would know immediately, and would respond, and any response Dumbledore could make right now was one Harry couldn't counter because he was 7 and didn't have his vault or his information or enough pieces. He needed to change something. But he needed to change it in a direction he could use. "There are some things," Harry said. "But I think, can the information stay here? I don't want it to go somewhere big. I just want my room. Can you make that happen?" Millicent Bramley looked at him for a long moment. Her face was doing something complicated. She was, Harry thought, a person who had come here expecting a form-filling exercise and had received something entirely different, and she was not sure yet what to do with the difference. "I can make a note of specific recommendations," she said carefully. "The family would be required to act on them." "Right," Harry said. "A room. Proper meals. And," he paused. Made it look like he was working up to something. "Could you check in again? In 6 months or so?" She looked at him. "That's not standard procedure," she said. "I know," Harry said. "But I think it would help." Another pause. She looked at his face. He let her look, made himself readable, made himself whatever a child looked like when they were asking for something small and reasonable instead of something large and catastrophic. "I'll note it," she said. "I can't guarantee frequency, but I'll flag the case for follow-up." "That's fine," Harry said. "Thank you." She finished her notes. She exchanged several more words with Petunia, whose color had not improved, and with Vernon, who had not recovered any of his earlier expansiveness and sat reduced and mutinous in his armchair. She said the words recommendation and compliance and further inquiry in a voice that made them sound like statements rather than warnings, which Harry thought was a more effective approach than warnings. She left at 3:45. The front door closed. The house was silent. Harry sat on the sofa in Dudley's blue jumper and looked at his hands and waited. Vernon stood up. He crossed the sitting room in 3 strides that were the most controlled movement Harry had seen him make in years, all of it folded in, compressed, which was the most dangerous kind. He stopped in front of Harry and looked down at him with an expression that was past red and into something colder. "What," he said, "do you think you just did?" "I told her the truth," Harry said. "She was a welfare inspector. I thought that was what she was for." "You little, Vernon," Petunia said. Vernon stopped. His wife was standing in the doorway between the sitting room and the hall, and the look on her face was one Harry had never seen on her before. Not the usual angles, not the pinched disapproval or the managing efficiency or the brittle performance of normalcy. Something stripped of all of that. Something that looked almost tired. "She's filing a recommendation," Petunia said. "He gets the box room." She didn't look at Harry. "We need to move Dudley's things. Over a few broken, Vernon." Her voice was flat. "Final. The ministry will follow up. We don't need further inquiry. He gets the box room." Vernon looked at Harry. Harry looked back. "Fine," Vernon said. The word was a door slamming. He walked out of the sitting room and up the stairs, and a moment later they heard him in the box room, moving things with the specific violence of a man doing something he bitterly resents. Petunia stood in the doorway. Harry looked at her. For a moment, just the fraction of a second before she reconstructed herself, her face did something unguarded. Something that moved through guilt and landed somewhere more complicated, more real. Then she straightened. "Don't," she said, very quietly, "do that again." "I won't need to," Harry said. "I'll have a room." She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen smell drifted through from behind her, something she'd left on the stove. "I know what I saw," Harry said, just as quietly. "I know what the money is. I know the name. I'm not going to tell anyone, not the ministry, not anyone else. Not yet." He paused. "But I need you to understand that I know. The guilt on Petunia's face flared and she pressed it down and he watched her press it down and they both understood that they had arrived, in this moment, at something different from before. Not honesty, he didn't expect honesty from her and she didn't expect trust from him. Something more like mutual acknowledgement. An understanding that a certain pretense was over. "The box room will be ready by the weekend," she said. "Thank you," Harry said. She went back to the kitchen. He sat alone in the sitting room in Dudley's blue jumper and felt the shape of the afternoon. He had a room now. The Ministry had been woken up, not dramatically, not in ways that would immediately reach Dumbledore as an emergency, but marked. Flagged. A case with a follow-up note. He had done it without exposing everything he knew, without giving Dumbledore a clear picture of how much Harry understood, without triggering any response that could be directed at him specifically. He had moved a piece. One piece. A small one. But the board was different now than it had been this morning, and that was the point. He was 7. He had 2 more years before Gringotts would give him the sealed letter. He thought about what other pieces he could move in 2 years, and how to move them without revealing the shape of his strategy, and what the board would look like by the time he was ready for the next real move. The box room took Vernon a weekend to clear and Petunia 3 days to make presentable, and Harry moved in on a Thursday without ceremony. He put his torn book on the windowsill and his marble and his button on the shelf above the bed and sat on the mattress and looked around at the room, which was small but had a window, and the window had actual sky in it. He'd never had a view of the sky before. The cupboard's only ventilation was the gap under the door. He sat on the bed and looked at the piece of sky in the window, blue, with one elongated cloud moving across it, and felt something that wasn't triumph exactly. More like a settling. Like the feeling of something that was always in the wrong position finally being shifted to where it had always been supposed to go. He was small and thin and wearing 2 large clothes and sleeping on an old mattress with springs that objected to being used, and he had a view of the sky. He thought it was, on balance, quite a good start. The follow-up visit came in November, as promised, a different representative this time, a tired-looking man named Aldous who seemed to have even less investment in the form-filling than Millicent Bramley had started with. He walked through the box room with the speed of someone who has been told to check and is checking, and found it acceptable, and said so. He also, and this part Harry had not anticipated, mentioned, in the tone of someone referencing something they'd been briefed on, "Headmaster Dumbledore sends his regards, by the way. Asked me to let you know that Hogwarts is very much looking forward to having you." Harry was sitting on his bed during this, and he looked up at the tired man and said, "That's kind of him." And that was all he said. But he held the information carefully, turning it over as the man wrote his closing notes and said his goodbyes. Dumbledore knew about the visit. Dumbledore had sent regards. Which meant someone had told him, Millicent Bramley's report had reached his desk, and his response was not alarm but regards. Not adjustment but reassurance. Dumbledore was not worried. Harry found this interesting, because it suggested that Dumbledore had a picture of Harry in his head, a 7-year-old, undersized, living in a cupboard, quietly asking a ministry representative for a room that fit neatly inside the expected shape of things. A child who'd reached his limit with the cupboard. A child managing a difficult situation. Nothing that altered the fundamental projection. He thinks I'm on track, Harry realized. He thinks the cupboard was too much, I complained, I got my room, I'm still the same child he arranged for. He didn't know about Gringotts. He didn't know about the library visits or the garden experiments or the accumulated body of knowledge Harry had been building for 2 years. He knew about the welfare visit and the room and that was all. Harry looked out his window at the November sky, which was white and low and had the texture of something about to snow. Good, he thought. Stay not worried. He'd read enough in the history books, both ordinary and, from the one library book that had slipped through in the local history section, magical, to understand that the most dangerous thing about Albus Dumbledore was not his power. It was his certainty. He had been running the magical world's most significant pieces for so long, from so elevated a position, that he'd stopped questioning his own projections. He expected certain things to be certain ways, and when they were, he didn't look further. The arrangement was supposed to produce a specific kind of boy. Dumbledore had been checking on the arrangement for 7 years and finding it proceeding satisfactorily. His picture of Harry was therefore a picture of someone who was not, at age 7, alone in Surrey, supposed to know anything, do anything, understand anything. Harry was going to let him keep that picture for as long as possible. Not out of fear. He wanted to be clear with himself about this. Not because Dumbledore frightened him, though he understood, intellectually, that the man was extremely powerful and would be an extremely significant obstacle when they eventually encountered each other as themselves. Not from fear. From strategy. Because the moment Dumbledore looked at Harry and saw something other than what he expected, the game changed and Harry was not yet ready for it to change. He needed his vault. He needed the sealed letter. He needed to be at Hogwarts, in the structure, surrounded by people and resources and legal standing that he didn't currently have. He needed to be 11. He had 3.5 years. He lay back on his too springy mattress and looked at the piece of winter sky in his window and did what he'd become very good at. He waited. He planned. He accumulated. Outside, it began to snow. The first flakes landed on his window and dissolved against the glass, and Harry watched them go and thought about Dumbledore's regards and a tired man with a briefcase who'd come to check a box, and about how much could be hidden inside the shape of expectations. Inside the house, Vernon was watching television and Petunia was doing something in the kitchen, and it smelled like cooking, and there was a view of snow in the window, and Harry was still small and thin and wearing too large clothes. But he had a room. And he knew the board. And nobody who mattered had any idea how much he'd already moved. Chapter 4, The Vaults. The coach from Surrey to London cost £3.20 now. Harry had £4.50, earned over 18 months of meticulous, almost invisible accumulation, coins found in Dudley's laundry, the occasional 10 pence that rolled under the refrigerator, twice finding notes that Vernon had dropped in the hall and not noticed, once discovering a whole £1 coin in the park that nobody came back for, and 40 minutes of Harry sitting nearby looking at nothing. He was 9 years old and he had a plan and the money for it, and a Saturday in August when the Dursleys were going to a garden party 3 streets over that Harry had successfully established, through 2 weeks of careful groundwork, that he was too ill to attend. He wasn't ill. He was entirely fine. He'd spent Wednesday and Thursday making himself convincingly unwell, not dramatically, nothing that required medical attention, just the particular muted quality of a child who isn't quite right, the slightly off energy that adults read without interrogating. Petunia had looked at him Thursday evening with the assessing gaze she applied to anything that might create a logistical problem, and had decided he was genuine, and had told Vernon he'd stay home, and Vernon had said suits me, and that was that. He got up Saturday morning, confirmed through the kitchen window that the Dursley car was gone, put on his cleanest too large jeans and a jumper that was only slightly over large, and walked to the coach stop. The August day was warm and the city smelled like hot tarmac and chips when he arrived, and Diagon Alley, when he found it, was considerably more crowded than it had been on his first visit 2 years ago. Summer crowds. Families. Children his age and older with parents and shopping lists and the particular high energy of school-related purchasing. Harry moved through the crowd with the not quite visible quality he'd been practicing since he was 6. Not invisible, he'd tested that and found full invisibility was something else, something he didn't have reliable control over yet. But below the threshold of notice. An unremarkable small boy in too large clothes, moving through a busy alley, briefly an object among objects. He went straight to Gringotts. Ragnarok was not at the desk. Harry stood at the counter and waited while the goblin currently stationed there finished a transaction with a family to his left, and used the time to look around the bank. It was the same as he remembered, vast, marble, temperature-controlled in a way that felt deliberate, slightly intimidating in the architectural sense. The goblins moved with the efficiency of people who had been doing this specific work for centuries and had refined it past the point where any individual motion could be considered unnecessary. The family finished. The goblin looked at Harry. "Name," he said. "Harry Potter," Harry said. I was here 2 years ago. Ragnock was, I know who you are, the goblin said. He was looking at Harry's forehead, where the fringe was pushed back from the August heat. Wait here. Harry waited. Around him the bank processed its Saturday business. 2 minutes later the goblin returned. Ragnock will see you, he said, with the air of someone slightly surprised by this, and led Harry through a side door and down a corridor that went back further than the bank's exterior suggested it should. Ragnock's office was smaller than Harry had expected, practical rather than impressive, with the organized density of a space used by someone who kept everything because everything might eventually be relevant. There were ledgers stacked with precise purpose. Charts on the walls that Harry couldn't read but that had the look of things tracking multiple variables over long periods of time. A window that looked onto something underground and lit by torchlight, which shouldn't have been possible given the building's location but which Harry had stopped applying Surrey logic to. Ragnock himself looked exactly as he had 2 years ago, which Harry would later understand was because goblins aged on a completely different scale from humans. He was sitting behind his desk with a ledger already open. Harry Potter, he said. You're back. I said I would be, Harry said. Though not until 11. I know I still can't access the sealed vault contents. Correct, Ragnock said. You have 2 years. I know. Harry sat down without being invited, which Ragnock noted with a slight movement of his eyes but didn't comment on. But I wanted to know what I can access now. The trust vault, is there any provision for early access given exceptional circumstances? Ragnock regarded him. Define exceptional circumstances. Deliberate suppression of the heir's resources by the designated trustee for purposes contrary to the heir's interests, Harry said. He'd found the phrasing in a book about estate law in the Magnolia Road Library, and had spent 3 weeks working out how to translate it into something applicable to his specific situation. Ragnock was quiet for a moment. He looked at Harry with the particular quality of attention that Harry had noticed on his first visit, not quite surprise, because goblins didn't tend toward surprise as an expression, but something evaluative. Weighing. You've been doing your reading, Ragnock said. I have access to a decent library, Harry said. Ragnock looked at the ledger. Turned several pages with the deliberate precision of someone who already knows what they'll find and is confirming rather than discovering. The trust vault, he said, was established under terms that specify disbursement for educational materials and associated costs beginning at age 11. There is no early access provision in the standard terms. He looked up. However. Harry waited. Gringotts has its own set of protocols regarding vaults whose management has been demonstrably compromised. Ragnock turned the ledger to face Harry partially, not enough to read the specifics, but enough to see the shape of the entries. You are the sole living Potter heir. The trust was established by your parents and administered through a third party. If that third party's administration can be shown to have worked against your interests, he's been paying himself from my vault, Harry said. Not directly. Through a disbursement to my relatives that's described as maintenance costs. But the money goes to people who were paid specifically to mistreat me. Ragnock looked at him for a long time. You can demonstrate this, he said. I have a ministry welfare report from 2 years ago that documents the conditions of my housing, Harry said. I have the Gringotts records, which you showed me on my last visit, of the monthly disbursements. And I have, he paused, because this part was more difficult to document and he knew it, direct knowledge of the arrangement. Though that last one might be harder to use. The welfare report and the disbursement records would be sufficient for a formal inquiry, Ragnock said. An inquiry into the administration of the trust. He closed the ledger. This would require you to formally contest the trust administration. What would that give me? At minimum, suspension of the disbursements to the Privet Drive address and an independent review of how the trust has been managed. Ragnock's voice was precise and dry and entirely without inflection. At maximum, full contestation of the trust arrangement, which would transfer administration to Gringotts directly, under goblin oversight, until you reach majority. Which would mean the money to the Dursleys stops immediately upon filing. Harry thought about this. The money stopping immediately, Petunia and Vernon losing the monthly payment, was both satisfying and potentially counterproductive, depending on how they responded. If they responded by contacting Dumbledore, which they almost certainly would, Dumbledore would know something had moved. He'd start looking more carefully at Harry. 2 years before Harry was ready. Can the inquiry be filed quietly? Harry asked. Without going through the ministry? Gringotts is not a ministry institution, Ragnock said, with what Harry had come to recognize as the goblin equivalent of considerable feeling. We conduct our own inquiries through our own processes. Ministry notification is not required unless the inquiry reaches a stage that involves criminal conduct, Harry said. Or matters of significant public interest, Ragnock said. A disputed trust administration is neither. Harry did the arithmetic. File the inquiry, he said. But, is there a way to file it so that the disbursements are reviewed rather than suspended immediately? I want to know what I'm dealing with before anything changes at Privet Drive. Ragnock looked at him steadily. You want the investigation without the immediate consequence. I want to know the full picture before Dumbledore knows I'm looking, Harry said. A pause. Then Ragnock did something Harry had not seen him do on the first visit. He inclined his head. Just slightly. The motion of one party acknowledging another's position. A preliminary inquiry can be filed as an internal review, he said. No disbursement changes until the review reaches a formal conclusion. At your direction. Yes, Harry said. Please. Ragnock pulled a form from the desk's second drawer. He wrote on it with a quill that moved faster than any hand Harry had seen. He slid it across. Sign at the bottom, he said. Your magical signature will be sufficient. Harry looked at the form. It was dense and formal and in at least 2 languages, one of which he was fairly sure wasn't English or anything he'd seen before. He read it as carefully as he could, which took 4 minutes that he spent in silence while Ragnock waited without any sign of impatience. The section about goblin oversight, Harry said. What does that cover exactly? It means, Ragnock said, that Gringotts has the right to conduct independent examination of any transaction related to the Potter accounts from the point of the inquiry's filing. Including historical transactions going back to the original disbursement arrangement. Including the sealed vault. The sealed vault's contents remain sealed, Ragnock said. But the records of its establishment, who filed it, under what authority, what instructions were attached, those fall within the scope of the inquiry. Harry looked up. This was more than he'd come for. He'd come for the trust vault situation, for the disbursements, for documentation. But if Gringotts could look at the records of the sealed vault, who had sealed it, on what authority, that was the kind of structural information that changed things. Do it, he said, and signed. His magical signature, it turned out, looked nothing like his ordinary handwriting. When the quill touched the parchment the ink flared briefly gold before settling black, and the parchment seemed to shift slightly, settling into itself differently. Ragnock took it back and blotted it and added it to a file that already had Harry's name on it. The preliminary inquiry will take approximately 6 weeks, Ragnock said. You will receive notification through Gringotts' internal channels. As you do not currently have an established owl, we will flag the letter for collection at the alley counter. I'll be back, Harry said. I expected as much, Ragnock said. Harry stood. He straightened his too large jumper, which was one of the things he'd decided to stop doing the moment he had access to money and a way to spend it on himself without it being noticed. He looked around the office one more time, the ledgers, the charts, the impossible underground window. Can I ask you something? Harry said. You can ask, Ragnock said, in the tone of someone making no promises about answering. Why are you helping me? I'm 9. You could have told me to come back at 11 and not bother you. Ragnock looked at him for a moment. His expression was, as always, composed and exact and not easy to read. But something moved in it, briefly. "Goblins have long memories," he said. "The Potter accounts have been managed in ways that we found unsatisfactory for some time. We have been unable to act without a directive from the account holder." He paused. "You are the account holder." "And?" Harry said, because there was clearly an "and." Ragnarok's expression shifted by approximately 1 millimeter in the direction of something that might, in a human face, have been dry amusement. "And you came here at age 7, he said, alone, with no money and no adult, and presented yourself at the counter and asked to discuss your accounts. In 23 decades of working in this bank, I have not encountered that before." Harry thought about this. "I'll take that as a compliment," he said. It was intended as one, Ragnarok said, which Harry suspected was rarer than it sounded. He had 2 hours before he needed to be on the coach back. He spent 20 minutes in the alley, walking slowly and paying careful attention. He'd been here once before, 2 years ago, and had been moving too purposefully to really look. Now he looked. It was remarkable how ordinary it was, once you got past the surface of it. People buying things, arguing about prices, running into acquaintances. A mother scolding a child for touching something at a potions ingredient stand. 2 old men in conversation outside a bookshop with the specifically engaged quality of people discussing something they deeply disagreed about. A group of teenagers sitting outside an ice cream parlor with the loose, summer holiday posture of people with nowhere specific to be. A world. Just a world. Like Surrey but with different rules and considerably more interesting shop windows. He spent time at the bookshop, Flourish and Blots, the sign said, standing just inside the door and reading the shelves without touching anything, because he didn't have money to spare for books and didn't want to draw attention to himself by browsing extensively without purchasing. But he read the spines and noted the sections and filed what he could. Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1 through 7. A set by Miranda Goshawk, from what he could see. Magical Theory by Adalbert Waffling, shelved under foundational texts. A History of Magic by Bathilda Bagshot, thick, authoritative, the kind of spine that meant it was the standard reference rather than one of many options. He committed the titles to memory. He'd find them through other means, through other channels. He was getting better at finding things. He spent the remaining time at a second-hand shop near the alley's shabbier end that sold a mix of robes and books and various magical implements of uncertain provenance. The owner was a distracted man whose attention was primarily on a complicated-looking magical chess game he appeared to be conducting with himself, which made him ideal for Harry's purposes. Harry spent 40 minutes reading a water-damaged copy of Magical Theory while appearing to browse the robe section, memorized 3 chapters, and left without purchasing anything. He was 9. He was working with what he had. The coach back to Surrey was half empty. Harry sat in the window seat and watched London give way to suburbs and thought about what he'd done this afternoon. The inquiry was filed. Gringotts was looking at the Potter accounts with the kind of access that Dumbledore hadn't anticipated, because Dumbledore had been treating Gringotts as a storage facility for the past 8 years and had apparently not considered that the storage facility had its own institutional interests and its own very long memory. The sealed vault's establishment records were now within scope. Harry didn't know yet what was in the sealed vault. He'd been turning the question over since his first visit, a vault sealed by someone other than his parents, at the time of their deaths. The most logical thing was paperwork. Instructions. Something Dumbledore had put there to be found at 11, along with the letter he'd told Ragnarok was in there for Harry's 11th birthday. A narrative, Harry thought. A way of framing Harry's history and his destiny and what was expected of him, delivered at the moment Harry entered the world Dumbledore had been managing, before Harry had a chance to form his own understanding. The letter was almost certainly from his parents. He was sure of that. James and Lily Potter had known they might die, had been in hiding, had known they were targets, and they had put a letter in a vault for their son. That part made complete human sense. What Dumbledore had added to that vault, what instructions or information or constraints he'd attached to it, that was the piece Harry wanted. And now Gringotts was looking at it. He watched a field go by outside the window, gold with late August, and thought about his parents. He did this sometimes. Not with grief, exactly, he couldn't grieve people he had no memory of, and he'd decided early that performing grief he didn't genuinely feel was dishonest and he didn't have time for dishonesty with himself. But with curiosity. James and Lily Potter were people who had existed, who had loved him enough to die protecting him, and everything Harry knew about them he had assembled from fragments and inferences and the edges of other people's memories and the residue they'd left in vaults and legal structures. They'd had money. Old money. The trust vault had more than the letter from the solicitor in Petunia's kitchen had implied, and the main vault was substantial. They'd been part of the magical world in a significant way. They'd been in hiding when they died, which meant they'd been important enough to be worth hunting. And they'd put a letter in a Gringotts vault for him. Which meant they'd known he might need it. Which meant they'd known it might be a long time before he got it. He thought about Lily Potter, who'd been Petunia's sister. Who'd been magical in a family of non-magical people. Who'd gone to the same school Harry was going to in 2 years. He thought about what it meant that Petunia, who had apparently resented her sister's magic all her life, had taken money to manage the product of it. He thought about Petunia's face when he'd asked about the name, the wide eyes, the guilt, the thing underneath both of those things that he'd seen in the months since and was still trying to identify. Not just resentment. Not just guilt. Something older than both of them. Something that had to do with Lily and not just with Harry. He shelved it. He was 9 and he had 2 years and specific priorities, and the questions about Petunia's interior life, while genuinely interesting, were not at the top of the list. The coach pulled into the Surrey stop at 4:45. Harry walked back to Privet Drive in the warm August afternoon, went in through the back garden gate, and was in the kitchen making a start on the washing up when the Desley car pulled into the drive at 5:15. Petunia came into the kitchen and looked at him. "Feeling better?" she asked. "Precise. No warmth." "A bit," Harry said. "I mostly slept." She looked at him for a moment longer than the question required. He kept his face appropriately tired, appropriately recovered, the face of a child who'd spent the day sleeping off a mild indisposition and not the face of a child who'd taken himself to Diagon Alley and filed a formal inquiry with a goblin bank. She went to put the kettle on. Harry washed up in the quiet kitchen and thought about 6 weeks. 6 weeks for the preliminary inquiry. He was back at school in 3 weeks, which meant he could collect from the Gringotts counter during the October half-term, which meant he'd know the shape of the sealed vault's establishment records by late October at the earliest. He washed a mug. Rinsed it. Set it in the rack. 2 years felt long. But 2 years had already become 2 years minus 18 months of preparation and 1 filed inquiry and 3 chapters of magical theory memorized in a second-hand shop. 2 years was now 6 weeks for a report and 8 months to the next alley visit and another 12 after that before his birthday and the vault and the letter. It was, he thought, more manageable than it had seemed from the cupboard. October half-term arrived cold and windy, and Harry told Petunia he wanted to visit the library in town, which was bigger than the Magnolia Road one and required a bus ride, and which he'd used as a cover for 3 previous solo excursions, and which Petunia allowed with the specific tiredness of a woman who had stopped fighting the minor battles in order to conserve resources for the ones that mattered. He went to London instead. The Gringotts counter had a letter waiting for him, sealed in the bank's cream and bronze livery, with a small embossed key motif in the corner that Harry suspected was significant. He took it to a quiet corner of the bank's entry hall, a bench near a column, away from the main traffic, and opened it. It was 12 pages long. It was written in the precise, formal language of goblin legal documentation, which he'd been preparing for by rereading the estate law materials he'd found in the library. He read it very carefully, twice, which took 45 minutes and left him with the particular combination of satisfaction and cold fury that had become, over the last 2 years, his most reliable emotional state when encountering new information about his situation. The preliminary inquiry's findings, the monthly disbursements to the Privet Drive address had been established in November 1981 by a third party acting under a claimed guardianship authority. The third party was identified, in the formal records, only by a solicitor's reference number, a deliberate anonymization that Gringotts flagged as unusual and, in their assessment, procedurally irregular. The claimed guardianship authority had never been formally registered with either Gringotts or the Ministry of Magic's guardianship records. It existed only in the bank's original disbursement instruction, filed by the solicitor. The disbursements had been drawn, not from an external account, but from the trust vault, Harry's money, as he'd already known, but now formally documented by Gringotts as an irregularity. And then the sealed vault. The sealed vault had been established on the same day as the disbursement arrangement, November 1981. It contained, per the establishment records, one letter from James and Lily Potter, sealed and marked for delivery on Harry's 11th birthday. And one additional sealed instruction document, filed by the same anonymous third party under the same unregistered guardianship authority, which appeared to attach conditions to the delivery of the first document. Conditions. Harry read this section 3 times. The third party had attached conditions to the delivery of his parents' letter. Conditions that, and here the Gringotts language became very precise, very dry, and very deliberate, appear to regulate the recipient's emotional and psychological state at the time of delivery, with specific reference to ensuring a disposition of gratitude and compliance toward the wizarding world in general and certain named institutions in particular. Harry sat on the bench in the entry hall of Gringotts and looked at this sentence for a long time. His parents had written him a letter. And Dumbledore had attached conditions to when and how Harry received it. Conditions designed to ensure Harry arrived at the letter grateful and compliant. Conditions that were, in effect, instructions to Gringotts to evaluate Harry's state of mind before handing over his dead parents' words. He folded the report. He put it inside his jumper, against his chest, where it couldn't be seen. He sat for another minute on the bench. The fury was there. He didn't suppress it and he didn't perform it. He felt it cleanly, the way you feel a clean cut before the nerves catch up, a brightness, a clarity, a full understanding of exactly what had been done and by whom. He felt it and then he set it aside, very deliberately, the way you set a tool down when you're done with the part of the job that required it, because he had another part of the job to do. He stood up. He went back to the counter. He asked for Ragnarok. The conditions on the letter delivery, Harry said, sitting across from the goblin again. Can you remove them? Ragnarok looked at him steadily. They were filed under a claimed guardianship authority, he said. An authority that, as our inquiry notes, was never formally registered. Which means, Harry said. Which means, Ragnarok said, very carefully, that the legal validity of those conditions is, at minimum, in question. And if the conditions are invalid, then the vault contents revert to their original terms, Ragnarok said. As established by the original depositors. Your parents. Harry thought about this. His parents' original terms would be, a letter for their son on his 11th birthday, with no conditions attached. Just a letter. Just James and Lily Potter's words, delivered to their son when he was old enough to need them. Challenge the conditions, Harry said. On the basis of unregistered authority. Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. This would advance the inquiry to a formal stage, he said. Which would require notification to the relevant parties. Including Dumbledore. The notification would go to the solicitor of record, Ragnarok said. Who represents the third party. Whether that solicitor chooses to communicate with their client in a timely fashion is not within Gringotts' control. He paused, precisely. Goblin post is efficient. Solicitor response times can be variable. Harry looked at the goblin. Ragnarok looked back with the expression of a man who has said exactly what he intended to say and nothing more. How long would the formal challenge take? Harry asked. The formal challenge of an unregistered authority claim, Ragnarok said, typically resolves within 18 months. During which time, as the account holder, you would have the right to request an interim delivery of the unsealed document, the letter from your parents, while the conditions document remains under challenge. 18 months put it at April of next year. 6 months before his 11th birthday. 6 months before Hogwarts. 6 months before Dumbledore's planned delivery of the narrative he'd arranged. "File it," Harry said. "It will cost," Ragnarok said. "Formally. The fee for a guardianship authority challenge is drawn from the trust vault." "It's my money," Harry said. "It is," Ragnarok agreed. "Then it's a reasonable use of it," Harry said. Ragnarok began writing. Harry sat in the chair and watched him and felt, under everything else, something that it took him a moment to identify because he felt it so rarely. Something warm. Not quite happiness, not quite the word for it. More like the feeling of a machine being correctly assembled. Of pieces fitting the way they were designed to. He had filed an inquiry. The inquiry had found what he expected. He had escalated it. In 18 months he would have the conditions removed and his parents' letter delivered ahead of schedule, and Dumbledore would know, eventually, through the solicitor, through whatever response system he had, that someone had been in his architecture. That something had moved. But by then Harry would be 10 and a half. Almost 11. Almost at the starting line. And Dumbledore still wouldn't know who was moving things. Harry walked out of Gringotts into the October alley, which was grey-skied and less crowded than August, and turned his collar up against the wind, and went home. The formal challenge notification went out the following week. The solicitor received it. The solicitor, presumably, contacted their client. Harry was in school on a Thursday in late October when it would have been received, learning long division, and he thought about it briefly during the part of the lesson where the teacher was writing on the board and he'd already worked out all the problems. He thought, now he knows someone is in the accounts. And then, but he doesn't know it's me. And then he finished the long division problems and moved on, because there was a great deal still to do and the time for thinking about Dumbledore was later. He still had 2 years. But 2 years, he thought, had a very different shape than it had the morning he'd woken up from the hallway incident with his uncle's memory in his head and a name he didn't recognize and no resources and no information and the crack just beginning to form in the wall. 2 years was almost short. He had a room now. He had a filed inquiry and a goblin who respected him and a formal challenge moving through channels that Dumbledore hadn't built and couldn't control. He had 3 chapters of magical theory and a detailed memory of every book spine he'd seen in Flourish and Blots and a very specific understanding of exactly what had been done to him and who had done it and why. He had, in other words, a foundation. He went back to his long division. Outside, the October wind moved through the school's oak tree, and somewhere in London a solicitor was composing a letter to a very certain, very powerful man about a disputed vault, and in a goblin bank the inquiry was advancing, and the shape of Harry's life was, piece by careful piece, becoming something other than what had been arranged. He was 9 years old and he was, in every way that mattered, already ahead. Chapter 5, Sirius. The news came on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 weeks before Harry's 10th birthday, and it came the way all significant news came at number 4, Privet Drive, through the television in the sitting room, which Vernon watched with the reverent attention of a man whose opinions needed regular external validation. Harry was in the kitchen making breakfast. Eggs, toast, the full production that Vernon required on weekday mornings before he felt sufficiently fortified to face Grunnings. Harry cracked eggs with the automatic efficiency of someone who had been doing this since he was tall enough to reach the stove, and he was half listening to the television the way he listened to most things in this house, with one part of his attention, the part that monitored for information, while the rest of him was elsewhere. The newsreader said, "Escaped from Azkaban prison." Harry's hand stopped. Sirius Black, convicted of the murders of 12 Muggles and Ministry informant Peter Pettigrew in 1981, has become the first person in the prison's history to escape its confines. Authorities are urging the public not to approach. Harry set the spatula down very carefully on the counter. Sirius Black. He'd found the name 4 months ago in the Gringotts inquiry documents, a peripheral reference, a name that appeared in the establishment records of the sealed vault. Not as the third party. As someone listed in his parents' original paperwork. Someone James and Lily Potter had named. The documents hadn't told him more than the name and its association with his parents, but he'd pulled at it in the subsequent weeks the way you pull at a loose thread, carefully and with attention to what unraveled. The library had given him pieces. A newspaper archive at the larger Surrey branch, the Magical World's newspaper, the Daily Prophet, was not available in Surrey public libraries, but the Muggle press had covered the 1981 murders because 12 dead Muggles were a Muggle story regardless of the magical element that the official narrative obscured. He'd found a street in London. An explosion. 12 people. A man laughing. The magical context he'd filled in from the Gringotts documents and 2 water-damaged books he'd found in the alley's second-hand shop and from Mrs. Figg's silences, which were by now very specifically shaped. Sirius Black had been his parents' friend. Had been accused of betraying them. Had been convicted and sent to Azkaban without a trial, which Harry had found in a footnote in the estate law book because under both Muggle and Wizarding legal frameworks the absence of a trial was a significant procedural irregularity and the book had flagged it as such. Without a trial. Harry had sat with this for weeks. Without a trial meant no evidence presented. No examination. No formal finding of guilt beyond the existence of 12 bodies and a man laughing in the street, which was not, in Harry's assessment, even at 9 years old, perhaps especially at 9 years old, the same thing as proof. He also knew one other thing about Sirius Black, from the Gringotts documents. His parents had named Sirius Black as Harry's godfather. And Dumbledore had placed Harry with the Dursleys anyway. He'd stored this information in the same place he kept all the important unresolved things, and had thought about it regularly and systematically, and had come to several conclusions. The first was that Sirius Black might be guilty, in which case the trial-less imprisonment was still procedurally wrong but the outcome was arguably just. The second was that Sirius Black might be innocent, in which case everything was considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. The third was that whether he was guilty or innocent, Dumbledore had bypassed the named godfather and placed Harry with people who'd been paid to treat him badly, which was wrong in either case. He'd been sitting with these conclusions for 4 months. Now Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban, which was, according to every source Harry had found, supposed to be impossible. Authorities are urging the public not to approach Black, who is considered extremely dangerous. Harry turned the eggs off, plated Vernon's breakfast, and thought very quickly. The panic in the magical world was immediate and total, which Harry knew because Mrs. Figg's curtains were moving in a way they didn't usually move and she'd had 3 visitors in 2 days, which was 3 more than she normally had. He watched from his bedroom window with the patient, cataloguing attention he'd been applying to Privet Drive for years, and counted the visitors and noted their arrival times and the length of their visits and filed it. Dumbledore was mobilizing. Tightening his information networks. Checking his pieces. Mrs. Figg came to the fence on Wednesday afternoon while Harry was in the garden and said, with the carefully casual manner of someone delivering a scripted line, "Terrible news about that black fellow, isn't it? You'll be staying close to home, I expect." "I expect so," Harry said. She lingered. He could see her working up to something. The way her weight shifted, the way her eyes went to his face and away and back. "Harry," she said, and stopped. He waited. "You're safe here," she said. "Whatever you might have heard. There are protections. You're very safe." "I know," Harry said pleasantly. She looked at him with the complicated guilt and relief expression he'd become very familiar with over the years, and then she went back inside, and Harry went back to pulling weeds, and thought about Sirius Black in the world somewhere. Escaped from Azkaban. The first person ever to do it. Harry thought about what kind of person escaped from a supposedly inescapable prison, and about what kind of person could be broken enough by years in that prison to still manage it, and about the specific question of where someone like that would go when they got out. The answer felt obvious, once he thought about it properly. He'd go to the thing he lost. The thing they'd taken when they locked him up. Harry was 10 years old and he was the thing Sirius Black had lost. He pulled a weed and thought about this and thought about what to do with it. What he did with it took 6 weeks to set up. The first piece was Gringotts. He couldn't go himself, the half-term wasn't for another month and manufacturing another solo London day would be pushing his luck after the August visit. But he'd established, on his last visit, a communication channel with Ragnarok through the bank's owl service, and he used it now. He wrote a letter. Ragnarok, I need to know if there is a way to send a confidential message to an individual whose current location is unknown. The message would need to be untraceable by third parties. I have reason to believe the individual would be receptive. I also need to know if the individual has any formal standing in relation to the Potter accounts, specifically whether their legal status as a named party in my parents' estate documentation is still active or was somehow revoked. Harry Potter. The response came back in 2 days, which was faster than expected and which Harry suspected meant Ragnarok had been watching for correspondence from him since the Azkaban escape made the news. Mr. Potter, Gringotts maintains a discreet courier service for sensitive communications. This service does not route through owl post and leaves no ministry traceable record. Fee applies. Regarding the individual's standing, the named godfather's legal status in the Potter estate was never formally revoked. It exists in the estate documents as originally filed. The administration of the guardianship, however, was transferred through a process whose validity is currently under inquiry. We note that the named godfather, were he to formally present himself to Gringotts as a party of interest in the Potter estate, would have standing to participate in the current inquiry. Ragnarok. Harry read this letter 3 times, then burned it in the garden using a small directed effort that produced a brief hot flame and nothing else. He'd gotten reliable with small fire in the last year. The letter said, if Sirius Black comes to Gringotts, he has legal standing. And we won't tell anyone he came. What Harry needed was a way to tell Sirius Black to come to Gringotts. The second piece was harder and required a week of thinking before he had anything usable. He thought about what Sirius Black knew. He'd escaped from Azkaban, which meant he'd been in there for almost 12 years, which meant his information about the outside world was severely limited. He'd know Harry was at Privet Drive, that was in the official narrative, the story the magical world told about what had happened in 1981. He'd know Harry was supposedly protected there. He'd know Dumbledore was involved. If he was innocent, and Harry had committed, after 6 weeks of deliberation, to proceeding on the assumption of innocence, because the alternative required trusting a system that had demonstrably not been trustworthy, then he'd be desperate, disoriented, and alone. He'd have no resources, no allies, and every branch of both the Muggle and magical authorities looking for him. He'd be cautious. He'd be watching things from a distance. He wouldn't come directly to Privet Drive, not with Dumbledore's protections on it and the whole of the ministry pointed his direction. But he might be watching. He might be nearby. Harry thought about the shape of someone who'd spent 12 years in Azkaban for something they didn't do, dreaming about the child they were supposed to be protecting, and who now found themselves free but hunted and alone. Where would you be, he thought, if you were that person? Close, he decided. You'd be close. Too much pride and guilt and grief to stay away entirely, but too much sense to walk up to the front door. Harry looked out his bedroom window at the suburban street. He thought about what a person hiding nearby would need. Food, first. Shelter. And information, specifically, whether the child was all right, whether the child was being treated properly, because if Sirius Black had spent 12 years in Azkaban believing he'd failed to protect James Potter's son, the first thing he'd want to know was the state of the son. Harry thought about this for several days. Then he did something that was either very smart or very reckless, and he decided he was comfortable with either assessment. He went out to the back garden on a clear April evening, when the light was long and golden and the Dursleys were occupied inside, and he sat on the garden wall and looked at the alley behind Privet Drive and said, in a conversational tone, as though talking to the garden, "I know you're out there. I've been expecting you. If you want to talk without anyone knowing, I know a way. Gringotts. Goblin Courier. They're not going to tell Dumbledore." He paused. "I already have an inquiry open. You have standing in it. Ask for Ragnarok." The alley was quiet. The birds went on with their business. Somewhere in the next garden a cat was doing something leisurely. Harry sat on the wall for another 5 minutes, then went inside and cooked dinner. He didn't know if it had worked. He had no way of knowing for 3 weeks, which was the longest 3 weeks of his life up to that point, and he spent them in the steady, methodical routine of Privet Drive, school, library, garden, cooking, practicing in the evenings, and didn't let himself think about it too much, because thinking about it too much was a way of making yourself fragile around an outcome you couldn't control, and he'd learned that fragility was expensive. He turned 10 on the 31st of July. Nobody at Privet Drive acknowledged it. He sat in the garden in the evening sun and ate a piece of cake he'd made himself the night before, a small one, yellow, with no icing because icing required patience and he'd run out, and thought about being 10. 10 felt significant. Not because of the birthday, birthdays were just days, but because 10 meant 1 year. 1 year until everything changed. 1 year until Hogwarts, until his vault, until the letter from his parents that Gringotts was currently working to liberate from Dumbledore's conditions. 1 year until he was in the world he was supposed to be in, with the resources he was supposed to have, surrounded by information and people and the structure of the thing he'd been preparing for since he was 5. He finished the cake. He looked at the evening sky. A week later, Ragnar's owl arrived. Mr. Potter, a party of interest has presented themselves at Gringotts and established their standing in the Potter estate inquiry. They have been briefed on the current proceedings and have expressed a wish to meet with you at a location of your choosing, outside of standard Gringotts facilities. They have indicated they are aware of your preference for discretion. If agreeable, please confirm a date and location. The Goblin Courier Service will convey the response. Harry read this in his room with the door closed, and felt something he was not entirely prepared for, a warmth in his chest, specific and unfamiliar, that was neither satisfaction nor strategy but something more personal and considerably harder to categorize. He wrote back, Sheffield. The cafe on Burgess Road near the train station. Saturday the 22nd, noon. He'll know it if he looks. He sent it. Then he looked out the window and thought about what you said to your godfather when you met him for the first time. Getting to Sheffield required more planning than London. It was further, for one. It required a train rather than a coach, which cost more and required a specific departure time. It also required a more elaborate cover story, because a whole day's absence was harder to account for than an afternoon. He spent a week constructing it. The story was, a school trip, organized through a program for academically high-achieving students, requiring parental consent and a day's absence on a Saturday. He produced the consent form himself, a meticulous forgery, typed on the school's headed paper from a letterhead he'd memorized on an earlier visit to the office. He presented it to Petunia with the flat, matter-of-fact confidence that had become his standard mode with her since the ministry visit, and Petunia, who had settled into a kind of cold armistice with him in the years since, signed it without significant interrogation. He was on the train at 7:45 on a grey Saturday morning, heading north, with enough money for the fare and the coffee he wouldn't order and the return and absolutely nothing left over. He found the cafe on Burgess Road because he'd looked it up in an atlas at the library and it was exactly where it was supposed to be. He sat at a table near the window with a glass of tap water and watched the street and waited. At 5 past noon, a man walked in. Harry had tried to prepare himself for what Sirius Black might look like after 12 years in Azkaban, but preparation and the reality were not the same thing. He'd expected thin, he was thin, drastically so, the kind of thinness that came from years of inadequate food. He'd expected pale, he was that too, though with a quality beneath it that suggested someone who had once been something else. He'd expected the general disarray of someone on the run. What he hadn't expected was the eyes. They were grey, and they were alive in a way that the rest of him hadn't quite caught up with yet. He moved through the cafe with a careful, scanning quality, someone reading exits and threats automatically, without thought, and his clothes were new but cheaply new, the kind of new that meant he'd found money somewhere or been given something from a charity, and his hair was longer than was fashionable and his cheekbones were too prominent and his hands, when he pulled out the chair across from Harry, were the hands of someone who had gripped things for a long time without anything good to hold on to. He sat down. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back. The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds, which was long in a cafe on a Saturday, and during those 5 seconds Harry watched Sirius Black's face move through several things: shock, recognition, grief, something so raw and specific that Harry felt it without any deliberate reaching, just the simple thermal radiation of someone whose feelings were currently too large for their body. "You look like James," Sirius said. His voice was rougher than Harry had expected. "Underused. And like Lily. Both at the same time." "People say that," Harry said. Another pause. The cafe noise moved around them. "You're the one who contacted Gringotts," Sirius said. "Not a question." "Yes." "You filed the trust inquiry." "Yes." "You're 10 years old." "Yes," Harry said. "Do you want some water?" "I've only got water, I don't have enough money for." "I'll get it," Sirius said, and stood up abruptly and went to the counter and came back with 2 coffees and a plate of toast, which he set in front of Harry with the manner of someone who needed to do something with their hands and was very glad to have found a task. Harry looked at the toast. "Thank you," he said. Sirius sat back down. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. He looked at Harry with the gray, alive eyes and the 2 prominent cheekbones, and Harry looked back and thought, innocent. He'd committed to the theory weeks ago, but sitting across from the man, it wasn't a theory anymore. It was just obvious, the way certain true things are obvious when you're actually in them. "Ragnarok told me about the inquiry," Sirius said. "About the vault. About the conditions on your parents' letter." His jaw moved. "I didn't know about any of that. I've been in Azkaban for 12 years and I didn't. I assumed Dumbledore was." He stopped. "Managing things," Harry said. "Yes. He was," Harry said. "Just not in the way you'd have wanted." Sirius made a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't a word. He looked at his coffee. "How long have you known about the arrangement?" "Since I was 5. Harry picked up a piece of toast. "I ended up in Vernon's head by accident. I saw the solicitor's visit. Heard the name." Sirius stared at him. "You were in Vernon's," he stopped again. "You're a Legilimens." Harry filed the word. He'd been looking for it for years. "Is that what it's called?" "It's rare," Sirius said. "I mean, extremely rare. Even in the wizarding world, you don't just have it naturally. You're supposed to study it for years and most people never." He was looking at Harry with an expression that was trying to be analytical and kept slipping into something more personal. "James wasn't. Lily wasn't. Though Lily she had a sensitivity to people. An understanding of them that went past normal. I got it from somewhere," Harry said. "Yes," Sirius said. He was quiet for a moment. "What did you see?" "In Vernon's head." Harry told him. All of it, or the parts that were relevant: the solicitor's visit, the money, the instructions, the word requirement. He told it in the flat, precise manner he'd developed for delivering information that carried significant emotional weight without letting the weight make the delivery imprecise. He watched Sirius absorb it and watched what it did to his face. It did quite a lot. There was anger, sharp, specific, the kind that came with a clear target rather than the diffuse fury of someone overwhelmed. There was grief underneath it. And underneath the grief, guilt, which was the kind that had already been there for 12 years and was simply being given a new specific shape. "I should have been there," Sirius said. "You were in Azkaban," Harry said. "Before that. I should have, the moment you went to those people, I should have." "You were arrested," Harry said. "The same night." "I know." Sirius looked at his coffee. "I know. He made a motion with his hand that meant regardless, and I know it's not rational simultaneously. Harry ate his toast and let the silence be what it was. "What happened?" he said, after a moment. Actually happened. The night my parents died. Sirius looked at him. Ragnarok said the trial records, Harry started. There weren't any trial records, Sirius said. There wasn't a trial. I know. I found a footnote in an estate law book. Why not? Sirius's expression moved through something complicated. Because Bartemius Crouch authorized my imprisonment directly. No hearing. No examination of evidence. There was a body and there was me in the street and there was chaos, and Crouch wanted it handled, and I was handled. He paused. I was laughing. When they found me. That probably didn't help. Why were you laughing? Because it was so, he stopped. Peter was alive. That's the important part. Peter Pettigrew, who everyone thought was dead in the explosion, who I was supposed to have killed, he was alive. I knew he was alive. He'd blown up the street himself and framed me, and I knew it, and I also knew there was absolutely nothing I could do about it, and I just lost James and Lily and I couldn't get to you, and there was nothing, just absolutely nothing I could do, and sometimes when there's genuinely nothing you can do he made a helpless gesture. Harry thought about this. Peter Pettigrew, he said. The ministry informant the news reports mentioned. He was the one who actually betrayed my parents. Yes. And he's alive. Yes. He's an animagus. Rat form. He faked his death and ran. Sirius's voice had gone very quiet. He's been living as a rat for 12 years. Harry sat with this. The world was very large sometimes, and not in the way that felt good. Right, he said. So you need two things. You need to prove Peter Pettigrew is alive, and you need a trial. Sirius looked at him with the expression that kept happening, the one that was trying to be analytical and kept slipping. Yes, he said. Yes. That's exactly what I need. Gringotts is already involved, Harry said. The inquiry into my trust administration overlaps with the guardianship question, which connects to whether the original arrest and imprisonment was procedurally valid. Ragnarok told me you have standing in the inquiry now. You can participate formally. Gringotts can't compel a wizarding trial, Sirius said. No, Harry said. But they can make noise. And if the inquiry formally concludes that the trust administration was improper, which it's going to, because it was, it'll create a public record of the circumstances. Including the circumstances of why the named godfather wasn't given custody. Including the fact that there was no trial. He watched Sirius follow this. It's not a guarantee, Harry said. But it's a lever. And we need levers. He'd said. He noticed Sirius notice it. You planned this, Sirius said slowly. The Gringotts approach, you planned it before you knew I'd escaped. I planned it because I needed the vault inquiry, Harry said. That you escaped was convenient. Sirius looked at him for a long time. Then he laughed. It was rough and unexpected and a little too sharp at the edges, the laugh of someone who hadn't done it properly in years, but it was real. Harry felt it without any reaching at all, just the simple warmth of something genuine. James would have, Sirius started, and stopped, and the laugh had something underneath it. Tell me about them, Harry said. Please. If you want. Sirius looked at him. Then he picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and drank some anyway, and began to talk. He talked for 2 hours. He talked about James Potter, who was arrogant and brilliant and loyal in the specific, total way of someone who decided that loyalty was the most important thing and had never wavered from that decision. He talked about Lily Evans, who had been the most perceptive person Sirius had ever met, who'd challenged James until the challenge made him better, who'd loved fiercely and specifically and without any tolerance for cruelty in any form. He talked about the Marauders, himself, James, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew, and the particular alchemy of 4 people who were genuinely themselves with each other in a way that didn't happen often in a life. Harry listened. He asked questions, specific questions, the kind that requested actual detail rather than general impression, because he'd been eating general impressions for years and what he wanted was detail. What did his father find funny? What made his mother angry? Were there photographs? Yes, Sirius said, in Dumbledore's possession almost certainly, but also in the possession of Remus Lupin, who was alive and teaching somewhere, Sirius had found out through careful inquiry. Remus Lupin, Harry said. He's a professor. Was, last I heard before 1981. He was having trouble keeping work. He's a werewolf. Sirius said it plainly, without apology or edge, the way you'd say he's tall or he's left-handed. The magical world is not, people are not kind about it. Where is he now? I'm not sure. I've had other priorities. Harry filed Remus Lupin under things to find. Does he know you're out? Harry asked. Not from me. He'll know from the news. He'll be worried about you. Sirius looked at the table. I imagine so. You should contact him, Harry said. I know. He didn't move. Harry looked at him. Saw, clearly, the 12-year gap, the difficulty of reaching towards something you'd lost, the way absence made contact feel like risk. He didn't have a framework for this from personal experience. But he understood it from observation, from the shape of it. He'll want to know you're all right, Harry said. I'm not especially all right, Sirius said. Then he'll want to know that too, Harry said. More, probably. Sirius looked up. The gray eyes were doing something unguarded. You sound like Lily, he said. I'll take that, Harry said. They sat in the cafe on Burgess Road while the Sheffield Saturday moved around them outside the window and the coffee went cold, and Harry thought about everything he'd learned and everything he still needed and what the board looked like now. It looked, he thought, substantially better than it had a year ago. He had an ally. A real one, not Ragnarok, who was genuine but whose loyalty was to goblin interests and institutional satisfaction rather than to Harry specifically. Not Mrs. Fig, who was Dumbledore's. Not even the accumulated knowledge from years of books and practice. A person. Someone who'd known his parents and loved them and was furious on Harry's behalf in the specific, hot way of someone who had a personal stake. Sirius needed things Harry couldn't directly provide, a trial, legal restoration, Peter Pettigrew found and exposed. But Harry could provide the Gringotts lever, which was real and already in motion. And Harry needed things Sirius could provide, photographs, stories, the lived texture of who James and Lily Potter had been. Access to the magical world through channels that weren't Dumbledore's. Someone who knew the landscape. They needed each other, which was not the same as a power imbalance or a rescue, and Harry was glad of the distinction. Where are you staying? Harry asked, when the practical question surfaced. Moving around, Sirius said. I can take I'm also an animagus. Dog form. It's easier to move without notice. Harry thought about a dog on the streets of Sheffield and felt something specific and uncomfortable. There has to be something better than that, he said. There really doesn't, Sirius said, with a shade of the dark humor that Harry suspected was structural to him, something that had been there before Azkaban and had survived it, bent and worn but intact. Gringotts, Harry said. There's a Potter property in the estate holdings, Ragnarok showed me the list during the preliminary inquiry. A cottage in Wales. It's been empty for years but it's in the estate, which means it's in the inquiry's scope, which means Dumbledore doesn't currently have clear access to it. Sirius stared at him. How do you know about the property list? I read the inquiry documents carefully, Harry said. The cottage is in Godric's Hollow. No, that one's complicated, that's the primary residence, there's an order of protection or something on it. The Wales property. It's called Place Mwyn. It's listed as a secondary holding and it's been sitting empty since 1979 because nobody's administered the estate properly. Because the trust administration has been, as Gringotts officially describes it, irregular, Harry said. Ragnarok can release the property to your custody as a party of standing in the inquiry. Tell him I said to. Sirius sat back in his chair and looked at Harry with an expression that was past the analytical trying and failing stage and had arrived somewhere more honest. James would have been so proud of you, he said. And completely terrified. Probably in equal measure, Harry said. Sirius smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached the grey eyes, and the 12-year gap was visible in it, all the things on the other side of it, but it was real. Yeah, he said. Exactly equal. They stayed for another hour. Sirius told him about the animagus process, illegal, as it turned out, he and James having performed it without registering with the ministry, which meant it was a secret still worth keeping. He told him about Hogwarts in a way that felt like the first real preview Harry had gotten, not textbooks, not tourist view, but the texture of the place as lived in. The Great Hall at night. The particular atmosphere of certain corridors. The secret that the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side always smelled of old stone and something sweeter that nobody had ever been able to identify. Harry listened to all of it. At 2:30 he had to leave to catch his train. He stood up and straightened his too large jumper. For the last time, he thought, with Sirius now formally in the estate inquiry, he could requisition school funds early for appropriate clothing, which was a different and petty victory but a victory nonetheless. Sirius stood too. He was taller than Harry had processed while sitting, tall and too thin and alive in a way that kept surprising him. "All right," Harry said. "Through Ragnarok's courier. It's clean." "All right," Sirius said. "Get the cottage," Harry said. "Tell Ragnarok I authorized it. Get somewhere to sleep properly." "Yes, sir," Sirius said, with the dark humor shade, and then his face shifted into something serious and said, "Harry." Harry looked up. "I'm sorry," Sirius said. "For not being, for the years. For all of it." Harry looked at him. "You were in Azkaban," he said. "Still." Harry considered several responses. He thought about the ones that would be most accurate, the ones that acknowledged that yes, there were years he should have had a godfather and didn't, and that Azkaban wasn't Sirius's fault but the years were still years. He thought about the ones that would be most merciful, that would take the guilt and put it somewhere reasonable. He chose the one that was most true. "You're here now," he said. "And I've got a plan. We're fine." Sirius looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," he said, and his voice was rough again. "Okay. Yeah, we are." Harry walked out of the cafe on Burgess Road and into the Sheffield afternoon and caught his train and looked out the window all the way south and thought about grey eyes and James Potter's laugh described in someone else's voice and a cottage in Wales called Plas Mwyn and 1 year left. 1 year. He thought about Dumbledore, who believed he had an obedient weapon in a cupboard in Surrey, and who had no idea that weapon had been filing legal inquiries and taking coaches to London and meeting escaped prisoners in Sheffield cafes and building, piece by careful piece, an entirely different architecture. He thought about what happened when Dumbledore finally looked and saw what was actually there. He thought about being ready for that moment. Outside the train window, England moved past, fields and towns and the long light of summer, and Harry Potter, 10 years old, thought about being ready, and decided with the specific, quiet conviction that had governed him since he was 5 years old sitting in a cupboard with rain outside and a name in his head, he was going to be more than ready. He was going to be everything they hadn't planned for. Chapter 6, The Letter. He was ready for the Hogwarts letter arrived on a Tuesday. Harry was in the kitchen making breakfast when the owl came, not the serious tawny bird from years ago, this one younger and more energetic, tapping the window with the impatience of something that had been flying since dawn and wanted acknowledgement. Harry opened the window, took the letter, gave the owl a piece of toast that it accepted with dignity, and stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the envelope. Mr. H. Potter, the second bedroom, 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Second bedroom. Not cupboard under the stairs. Someone had updated the address at some point, probably after Millicent Bramley's report, probably a clerical change so routine that whoever made it hadn't thought twice. Harry looked at it and thought about the version of this letter that would have arrived if he hadn't said anything in the sitting room 4 years ago. The cupboard under the stairs. He'd have opened that letter and it would have been the first indication from the world he belonged to that it knew where he actually slept. He put the toast on for Vernon and opened the letter. It was everything he'd expected from Flourish and Blot's shelf: parchment, formal hand, the Hogwarts crest in deep red and gold. The list of required books and equipment. The instruction to report to King's Cross on September 1st, platform 9 3/4. An invitation to visit Diagon Alley for supplies. He read it twice, folded it, put it in his pocket, and flipped Vernon's eggs. By the time Vernon came downstairs the kitchen smelled like breakfast and Harry was washing up the pan, and his face was the same as it always was, neutral, unremarkable, easy to not look at, and nothing in his posture suggested that he'd just received the letter he'd been preparing for since he was 5 years old. Vernon ate his breakfast and read his paper and left for work without looking at Harry once. Harry dried his hands and went upstairs and sat on his bed and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Ragnarok. The Hogwarts letter has arrived. Please confirm the formal challenge resolution timeline and status of the parent letter delivery. I'll collect from the counter when I come for supplies. The second was to Sirius, at Plas Mwyn in Wales where he'd been living since August, in the cottage that Gringotts had quietly transferred to his custody as a party of standing in the Potter estate inquiry. Letters here. I'm coming to Diagon Alley on Saturday. Come with me. I want a witness. He sent both through Ragnarok's courier service, a small, dark owl that arrived at his window within 40 minutes of his sending the first letter, as though it had been waiting in a tree somewhere. He hadn't asked Ragnarok about this arrangement directly. He'd decided to accept it as what it appeared to be, a goblin institution extending professional courtesy to a client it found satisfactory. He sent the letters and closed the window and started on the reading list. He'd already read 3 of the books. The water-damaged magical theory from the alley's second-hand shop, memorized 2 years ago. A copy of the Standard Book of Spells, grade 1 that he'd found in the same shop on a subsequent visit. A history of magic text that the Surrey Library had somehow acquired, presumably by accident, which had sat in the folklore section misfiled between 2 books about King Arthur. He'd read it 4 times. The books he didn't have he made a list of, added the equipment requirements, estimated costs against the trust vault funds that Ragnarok had confirmed were now under proper oversight, and put the list in his desk drawer. He was ready. He'd been ready. The letter was just the official notification of what he already knew. Sirius's reply came back in 6 hours, Saturday. I'll be there. I'm bringing my face so dress for the occasion, mine, not yours, the wanted poster one. Harry read this and thought about Sirius's face on wanted posters all over the wizarding world and then thought about what it meant that Sirius would come anyway. He filed it under things that mattered and moved on to the practicalities. Petunia had read her own copy of the Hogwarts letter, a second one had arrived for the household, addressed to the guardians, and had spent 2 days being pointedly normal about it, which was Petunia's version of significant emotional upheaval. She didn't bring it up. Harry didn't bring it up. They moved around each other in the kitchen with the careful, practiced precision of 2 people who had been sharing a space in mutual acknowledgement of an unstated situation for 4 years, since the ministry visit, since the box room. On Thursday evening Harry came into the kitchen where she was doing the washing up and said, "I'll be going to Diagon Alley on Saturday for school supplies." Petunia kept washing the mug in her hand. "I know what it is," Harry said. "I've known for a while. You don't have to explain anything." Her hands stilled in the water. "Will you need," she started. "Money?" "No. I have my own." She turned then. Just slightly. Enough to look at his profile rather than the back of his head. He could feel the weight of what she wasn't saying, the accumulated years of it, the monthly payments and the solicitor's visit and the name she'd never admitted to knowing and the ministry representative and the box room. "Harry," she said. He looked at her. She looked back, and her face was doing the complicated thing, the thing that was older than him, that had to do with Lily and not just with him, that he'd been watching for 4 years and still hadn't fully categorized. "I knew your mother," she said. I know it doesn't change anything." "It doesn't," Harry said. "Not unkindly. Just accurately." She pressed her lips together. "She would have," she stopped. "What?" "She would have thought this was wrong," Petunia said, very quietly. "The arrangement." "What?" She would have been very angry. Harry looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I expect she would have." He went back to his room. He heard the washing up resume in the kitchen. He sat on his bed and looked out the window at the July evening, and thought about Lily Evans who'd had a sister, and about what it meant to make yourself complicit in something you knew was wrong, and about whether understanding why someone did something and forgiving them for it were the same thing. He decided they weren't. But he also decided that the people he was angry at were ranked, and Petunia was not at the top of the list. He got to the Leaky Cauldron at 9 on Saturday morning, before the crowds. Sirius was already there. He'd done something about his appearance. The hair was shorter, pulled back, and he'd found clothes that fit properly for once, which made him look less immediately like a man who'd been living rough and more like an ordinarily thin person having a slightly gaunt day. He'd done something with his face that wasn't quite a disguise but was the deliberate understatement of someone who didn't want to be recognized on first glance. He was sitting in the corner with a cup of tea and he stood up when Harry came in and they looked at each other and Sirius said, "You've grown." "It's been 3 months, Harry said. "Still." They walked through to the alley together. The morning was clear and the alley was already moving, not the full summer crowd of August, this was July, slightly earlier and slightly quieter but still busy enough that Harry's not quite visible quality was useful. He kept it on. He was aware, moving through the cobbled street with Sirius at his shoulder, that he was doing something visible for the first time in his life, something that could not be explained away as coincidence or misidentification if the wrong person looked. Sirius Black, escaped prisoner, walking through Diagon Alley with Harry Potter. He thought about this clearly, with the specific attention he brought to risk assessment, and decided that the risk was acceptable and the alternative, doing this alone, without witness, in the hope of being smaller and safer, was not something he was willing to do anymore. He was 11 in 3 weeks. He was done being small. Gringotts first. Ragnarok was expecting them. He led them, both of them, Sirius included, which made 2 of the other goblins in the corridor look up and then look away with the disciplined incuriosity of a professional institution that had seen significant things and had opinions about none of them publicly, into the office, and set 3 things on the desk. The first was the formal conclusion of the preliminary inquiry, which ran to 32 pages and documented in complete and damning detail the irregular administration of the Potter Trust, the unregistered guardianship authority, and the financial arrangement with the Privet Drive address. It concluded that all disbursements to said address were to cease immediately, that the trust administration be placed under formal Gringotts oversight, and that the matter of the unregistered guardianship authority be referred to the Wisengamot's Estate Oversight Committee. Harry read the summary page. He looked at Sirius, who was reading over his shoulder. "The Wisengamot referral," Sirius said to Ragnarok. "That goes through official channels." "It does," Ragnarok said. "Which means it will be visible to ministry officials." "And to Dumbledore," Sirius said. "We cannot control what the chief warlock of the Wisengamot is informed of by his office," Ragnarok said, with the precise neutrality that Harry had come to recognize as its own form of communication. Sirius looked at Harry. "He'll know by Monday," Harry said. "Probably. Does that change anything?" Harry thought about it. "No," he said. "We're in position. Changing anything now would mean retreating, and we're not retreating." Sirius looked at him with the expression that kept happening, fond and slightly alarmed in equal measure, and said nothing. The second thing Ragnarok set on the desk was a sealed envelope. Cream-colored, old, not aged badly old but preserved old, the way important documents kept in the right conditions could last decades without deteriorating. On the front, in handwriting Harry had never seen before, "For Harry, when he's ready." Harry's mother's handwriting, he assumed. Or his father's. He didn't know which. He picked it up. The formal challenge of the conditions document was resolved in your favor 8 days ago, Ragnarok said. The unregistered authority had no legal standing to attach conditions to the original depositor's document. The letter is delivered without conditions. Harry held it. It was lighter than he'd expected. He became aware that his hands were not entirely steady, which was new. He couldn't remember the last time his hands had been unsteady. He looked at the handwriting on the front for a moment. "I'll read this later," he said, and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest. Ragnarok moved on without comment. The third thing was a key. "Your trust vault," Ragnarok said. "Full access as of your upcoming 11th birthday. As the preliminary inquiry has concluded and trust administration transferred to Gringotts oversight, you may request an early access authorization given the circumstances. I can process that today, if you choose." Harry looked at the key. "Yes," he said. "Please." They went down on the carts, Harry, Sirius, and a young goblin cart driver who navigated the underground rails with professional disregard for the speeds involved and the turns that arrived with no apparent warning. Sirius held the side of the cart with the expression of someone who was not going to admit to finding this uncomfortable. Harry watched the tunnels go past and felt the cool underground air and thought about the last time he'd been on a cart, 2 years ago, when Ragnarok had shown him the vault from outside and explained what he couldn't yet access. The trust vault was not the enormous cavern Harry had half expected from the weight of the Potter name. It was a decent size, comfortable rather than vast, and it held a quantity of gold that Harry, doing quick mental arithmetic against the costs he'd researched, estimated was more than sufficient for 7 years of Hogwarts and considerably beyond. There were also documents, rolled scrolls, sealed boxes, a leather case that had his parents' initials tooled into the side. He took the leather case. He took a moderate quantity of gold into a small bag Ragnarok provided. He looked at the rest of it and thought about what it meant to have resources after 10 years of carefully hoarding bus fare and birthday card coins. "Right," he said to Sirius. "Now we shop." They went to Madame Malkin's first, because Harry's clothes situation had been a source of specific, practical frustration for years and he intended to address it with some efficiency. Madame Malkin was brisk and professional and did not appear to find anything unusual about an 11-year-old requiring an entirely new wardrobe from the foundations up, though she did say, measuring his arms, "You've had a growth year coming, I can see it in the bone structure, I'll leave room." Sirius stood near the door with his hands in his pockets and watched Harry being measured with an expression that was working hard to stay in the vicinity of normal. "Stop it," Harry said, without looking up from the measuring. "I'm not doing anything," Sirius said. "You're making a face." "I'm not," Sirius stopped. "Your father tried on his first robes in this shop." "I know," Harry said. "You told me." He kept trying to make the fitting witch laugh. "She didn't either." "Same woman, actually, I think, Madame Malkin. Did you know James Potter?" "Gryffindor, class of, I have known a great many students," Madame Malkin said composedly. "Hold still please." Harry held still and let her do her work, and Sirius stayed near the door and didn't make any more faces that he was willing to admit to, and Harry thought about his father at 11 years old standing exactly where he was standing and felt something quiet and specific move through him. He bought robes in 3 weights. He bought proper clothes, actual fitting jeans, shirts that weren't Dudley's cast-offs, a jacket that was his. He paid for them at the counter with gold from the trust vault and stood in the street afterward in clothes that fit him for the first time in his life and felt, very specifically, like himself. Ollivander's next. The shop was narrow and dust-and-wandwood quiet, and the man behind the counter was old in the way of things that have been exactly themselves for a very long time, white-haired, pale-eyed, with the specific attentive quality of someone who was always in the middle of a very long observation. He looked at Harry. His pale eyes went to the scar. Then they went somewhere else, looking at something Harry couldn't quite identify, something beneath the surface of things. "Harry Potter," Ollivander said. "Yes," Harry said. I need a wand. Yes. Ollivander came around from behind the counter with a measuring tape that moved on its own in a manner that was already somewhere in its own process. I remember every wand I've ever sold, Mr. Potter. Your father, Holly, 11 inches, mahogany, I believe, and your mother, Willow, 10 1/4, supple. Good wands. Both of them. I know, Harry said. Ollivander paused. His pale eyes came back to Harry's face. You know. Sirius told me, Harry said, and Sirius, standing in the doorway where he'd decided to wait on the grounds that the shop was too narrow for 3 people and that Ollivander's eyeline kept returning to him with a quality that made him feel examined, lifted a hand. Ollivander looked at Sirius for a moment. Then back at Harry. Well then, he said, and the measuring tape began its work, and Ollivander went to his shelves. The wand-finding process was what Harry had expected from what he'd read, a series of attempts, each revealing something by what it didn't do. Harry tried 7 wands in 12 minutes. 4 of them did nothing. 2 produced effects that Ollivander described as promising, interesting, not quite with the engaged precision of someone narrowing a search. 1 made the lamp on the counter explode, which Ollivander looked at thoughtfully before saying no, not that one. The 8th wand was different. Holly. 11 inches. The moment his fingers closed around it, the feeling was immediate: warmth, recognition, the sensation of something that had been slightly wrong suddenly being correct. A brief shower of red and gold sparks from the tip that scattered and faded like cooling embers. Holly and phoenix feather, Ollivander said, softly. 11 inches. Pliable. He was looking at Harry with his pale eyes and his long observation, and something moved in his expression. Curious. Very curious. The core, Harry said. Is it significant? The phoenix who donated the feather for your wand, Ollivander said, gave only one other. Its brother feather, well. Its brother feather gave you your scar. Harry looked at the wand in his hand. He'd known this was possible. He'd read enough, the second-hand books, the library materials, the edge of several different accounts of the night of October 31st, 1981, to have considered the possibility that Voldemort's wand and his might share a connection. He'd thought about it theoretically. Having it confirmed by the man who'd made both of them was a different experience. So we're connected, Harry said. In a manner of speaking, Ollivander said. I think we must expect great things from you, Mr. Potter. A pause. He who must not be named did great things. Terrible, yes. But great. I know, Harry said. I intend to be great in the less terrible direction. Ollivander looked at him for a moment. His pale eyes were doing the long observation thing. Then he said, very quietly, I believe you might manage that. Harry paid 7 gold galleons for the wand. He walked out of Ollivander's into the alley sunshine with the wand in its box under his arm and Sirius at his side, and thought about brother wands and phoenix feathers and 2 boys in a narrow shop in the same alley 30 years apart. They were coming out of Flourish and Blots, Harry with a stack of textbooks and the specific satisfaction of having found all 7 required titles plus 4 supplementary ones that had looked useful, when they encountered Draco Malfoy. He was with his father. Lucius Malfoy was a distinctive figure, tall, white-blonde, with the bearing of someone who had never once in his life been required to move out of anyone else's way. He was looking at a display in the window of the apothecary and he hadn't seen them yet. Draco was 11, the same as Harry would be in 3 weeks, and small in the way of children who haven't grown into themselves yet. He was watching his father with the specific attentive quality of someone trying to read what kind of mood they were in, which was something Harry recognized with a directness that bypassed analysis. Before Harry had consciously decided to, his attention had already done the thing, the settling, the receptive openness, and Draco Malfoy's surface was suddenly visible to him the way still water is transparent. What was there surprised him? Not cruelty. Not the comfortable contempt he'd expected from the books and from Mrs. Figg's carefully unsaid things about pure-blood families and their particular perspectives. What was predominantly there in Draco Malfoy at 11 years old was fear, specific, managed, chronic. The fear of someone who had spent their whole short life performing a role and was deeply uncertain what happened if they stopped. Underneath it, a desperate wish to be impressive. To be seen as capable. To be selected as sufficient by some authority whose approval moved constantly just out of reach. Harry looked at the father and saw where the fear came from. Draco turned and saw them. His gaze went to Harry, to the scar, which was visible, the fringe pushed back by the August heat, and recognition moved across his face immediately. Whatever prepared expression he'd intended to present dissolved briefly into something unguarded. "You're Harry Potter," he said. "Yes," Harry said. Draco's father had turned. Lucius Malfoy's pale eyes moved from Harry to Sirius, and here something happened in Lucius's face that was not fear but was adjacent to it, a recalibration, a rapid and visible reassessment of the situation. "Sirius," Lucius said. His voice was precisely controlled. "Lucius," Sirius said pleasantly. The pleasantness was a specific weapon. Harry noticed Lucius notice it. "I heard that there had been a development," Lucius said. "Several," Sirius said. "It's been a busy month." Draco was looking between them with the expression of someone who can feel the temperature of a room but doesn't know what's causing it. His eyes kept returning to Harry. "Going to Hogwarts?" Harry asked him. Draco blinked. Whatever social algorithm he'd been running paused. "Yes," he said. "First year." "Same," Harry said. "I know." Draco said it automatically and then seemed to realize how it sounded and added, "Everyone knows." "You're, well, famous," Harry said. "Yes. It's going to be annoying, probably." He watched Draco's face process this, the unperformed honesty of it, which apparently wasn't what he'd been braced for. "Are you ready for it?" "School." "Of course," Draco said, and then, more genuinely, "I've been prepared for years." "So have I," Harry said. Something shifted in Draco's expression. Very small. The specific shift of someone who had expected to feel superior and found the ground had been rearranged. Lucius moved then, a small, deliberate step that positioned him just slightly between his son and Harry, which was a protective gesture wearing the clothes of a dismissive one. "We should continue," he said. "Draco has several more shops, of course," Harry said. He looked at Draco. "I'll see you at school." Draco looked back. The fear was still there, and the desperate wish to be impressive, but there was something else now, curiosity. Genuine and slightly unwilling. "Yes," Draco said. They parted. Harry kept walking and Sirius fell into step beside him, and when they were far enough along the alley Sirius said, "Malfoy." "I know." His father was, "I know," Harry said. "What do you know about the son?" Sirius was quiet for a moment. "He's 11. "Yes. You're thinking something." "I'm thinking he's not what he's supposed to be yet," Harry said. "And neither am I. There's something interesting in that." Sirius looked at him sideways. "You sound like a professor." "Lupin sounds like a professor," Harry said. "Have you written to him?" A pause. "Not yet." "Sirius. I'm getting there." "Write to him," Harry said. "Tonight. Tell him where you are. Tell him I want to meet him." "You want to meet Remus?" "He was my parents' friend. He's a werewolf the world has been unkind to. He's probably lonely." "And," Harry considered. "I want him at Hogwarts." Sirius stopped walking. Harry stopped too and looked up at him. "You want Remus at Hogwarts," Sirius said. "As in, the defense against the dark arts position has been cursed since Voldemort," he said the name without hesitation, which made 2 witches nearby flinch and a wizard drop his bag, applied for it in the 1960s. "It's been turning over every year. Nobody wants it. Nobody competent, anyway." Harry watched Sirius's face. Remus Lupin was a marauder. He's been navigating a world that wants him to feel small and worthless for 30 years and he's still going. He knows things about defense that nobody who's spent their life comfortable and safe knows. Sirius was looking at him. I can't get him hired, Harry said. I don't have that kind of influence yet. But you might. You're a party of standing in a formal Gringotts inquiry. When that inquiry's conclusions hit the Wisengamot Committee, your name is going to be in them. You're going to be visible as Harry Potter's godfather. That's worth something. To Dumbledore? Sirius said. To Dumbledore, Harry confirmed. Who at this point knows someone has been in his architecture but doesn't know it's me? Who's going to receive the inquiry conclusions on Monday and make a move? And whose move I'd like to be ready for? Sirius ran a hand through his shorter hair. What move do you expect? He said. I don't know yet, Harry said honestly. But having Lupin at Hogwarts means having someone inside the school I trust. Someone who isn't Dumbledore's, or who at least knows they're not just Dumbledore's. Someone who knew my parents. Sirius looked down the alley for a moment. Looked back. I'll write to him tonight, he said. No conditions this time. Good, Harry said. They walked the rest of the alley, the remainder of Harry's list, a stop at the apothecary, a look at the broomsticks in Quality Quidditch Supplies window that lasted 4 minutes, during which Sirius gave a comprehensive comparative breakdown of every broom model from the 1970s onward, and came out eventually into the late afternoon sunshine of the Leaky Cauldron's back entrance, laden with bags, and stood in the alley for a moment. Food, Sirius said. I'm buying. Don't argue. I wasn't going to, Harry said. They went back inside. They found a table. The landlord brought menus and looked at Sirius with the expression of someone who thought they recognized him from somewhere unpleasant and couldn't confirm it, and Sirius smiled at him with complete ease, and the landlord went away. Harry ordered properly for the first time in his life, not the smallest thing on the menu, not with one eye on someone else's reaction. A full plate. Something that had cheese in it. He ate it while Sirius talked about Hogwarts and Quidditch and the precise and extended story of the time James Potter had accidentally transfigured Professor McGonagall's chair into a cat while she was sitting in it, and she had levitated 3 feet and said only Mr. Potter in the tone that was uniquely McGonagall's before performing the counter-charm herself. Harry laughed. Actually laughed, not the polite laugh performance he produced when adults expected it, but the real one, sudden and slightly undignified and completely genuine, and Sirius looked at him when it happened with the expression that was past fond and past alarmed and was somewhere that didn't have a clean name. There he is, Sirius said quietly. Harry looked up. What? James used to laugh like that. Sirius picked up his drink. Exactly like that. Harry looked at him. Stop making a face, he said. I'm not making a face, Sirius said, making a face. They stayed until the alley was winding down, until the summer evening turned the light outside amber and the shops began drawing their shutters. Harry sat with his wand box on the seat beside him and his bag of books at his feet and the letter from his parents still in his inside pocket, against his chest, unread. He hadn't been able to open it yet, wasn't sure why, thought it was because reading it felt like a thing that required a specific kind of private that he hadn't had yet today. They walked out together. At the Leaky Cauldron's front entrance, where it opened onto the Muggle Street, they stopped. Dumbledore's going to want to see you, Sirius said. After Monday. I know. Before Hogwarts, probably. Yes. What are you going to say to him? Harry thought about this. He'd been thinking about it, in various forms, for 6 years. What you said to someone like Dumbledore, someone powerful and certain and genuinely believing they were right, someone who had built a careful architecture around your life for a specific purpose and whose move, when they looked and found the architecture altered, could be significant. He thought about what kind of conversation that needed to be. Not a confrontation. Not a performance of anger, which he had in abundance but which was, in terms of strategic utility, blunt. Not an accusation, which would put Dumbledore in a defensive position, and defensive Dumbledore was almost certainly more dangerous than managed Dumbledore. What it needed to be was a demonstration. "I'm going to let him see me," Harry said. "Just, actually see me. What I know, what I've done, what I have. Without explaining it. Without justifying it." He thought about the 32-page inquiry conclusion and the wand in its box and the vault key in his pocket and the letter against his chest and Sirius standing beside him in clothes that fit after 2 years in a cell. He built something to produce a specific person. "I'm going to sit in front of him and be a completely different person and just, let him understand what that means." Sirius looked at him for a long moment. "And if he doesn't take it well?" "He'll take it the way he takes everything," Harry said. "He'll manage it. He'll tell himself it's fine, it can be worked with, the essentials are intact." Harry met Sirius's eyes. "And he'll be wrong. But he won't know that yet." "And when does he know?" Harry picked up his bags. "When I decide to show him," he said. He took the Muggle Street back to the coach stop. He rode back to Surrey in the August evening with his bags of books and his box of robes and the wand beside him on the seat. He walked back to number 4 in the dusk and went upstairs and sat on his bed and took the letter out of his inside pocket. He held it for a long time. Then he opened it. The handwriting inside was both of theirs, he could see it now, the 2 different hands taking turns, sometimes a sentence each, sometimes a word mid-thought passed between them. His mother's was neat and quick. His father's was larger, slightly less patient. He read it very slowly. It was not a letter about Voldemort. It was not a letter about prophecies or sacrifice or the greater good. It was a letter from 2 people who were afraid they might die and who wanted their son to know them, who they were, what they'd found funny, what they believed about the world. How much they loved him. Not in vague, enormous terms but in specific ones, the way he'd laughed as a baby, the particular expression he made when something surprised him, the name they'd almost chosen instead of Harry, the color of the wallpaper in his room at Godric's Hollow. His father wrote, "Don't let anyone tell you that being clever is the same as being difficult. We were told that constantly. Ignore them. Be as clever as you want." His mother wrote, "Magic isn't the most important thing. I know that sounds odd from me, but it's true. What matters is what you do with it. What you choose. That's the part that's entirely yours." His father wrote, at the end, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the earlier pages, "We love you. We're sorry we're not there. Be trouble, Harry. The good kind." Harry sat on his bed in the Surrey evening and read the letter twice more and then folded it very carefully and put it back in the inside pocket of his jacket. He was not crying. He'd decided earlier that he wasn't going to, not because he was suppressing anything but because what he felt looking at those 2 different handwritings was not something that needed tears. It was something that needed, keeping. Holding. Taking with him the way you take a compass. He took a breath. Be trouble, his father had written. The good kind. Harry looked out the window at the Surrey evening, the ordinary suburban street, the ordinary sky, the ordinary world that had been his entire geography for 10 years and would stop being so in 3 weeks. He thought about Dumbledore reading the inquiry conclusions on Monday. He thought about a conversation that was coming, and what he was going to walk into it knowing, and who he was going to be in it. He thought about his mother's handwriting, "That's the part that's entirely yours." 3 weeks. He was ready. Chapter 7, Hogwarts. The Hogwarts Express left at 11. Harry was on the platform at 10:15, which meant he'd been standing in King's Cross since 10, having arrived early enough to watch the Muggle half of the station fill with the ordinary Saturday business of people going places. He had a trolley with his trunk, new, from a shop in the alley, black with brass fittings, and his wand in his jacket pocket, and the specific internal quality of someone who has been preparing for a thing for 6 years and is now standing at the threshold of it. Sirius had come as far as the station entrance and stopped there, because the wanted posters were still up and the formal inquiry's Wisengamot referral had created noise without yet creating resolution. They'd said goodbye on the pavement. Right, Harry said. Every week, Sirius said. I mean it. He looked at Harry for a moment. Your father cried. When he got on this train. Don't tell anyone I told you. I won't, Harry said. He was also 11. He grew out of it. I'm not going to cry, Harry said. No, Sirius said. I know. He put his hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, just a moment, just enough to be there. Be trouble, Harry. The good kind. Harry looked at him. My father wrote that in the letter, he said. I know, Sirius said. He stole it from me. Harry walked into King's Cross and found the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 and stepped through it without hesitation and came out on the other side into the specific atmosphere of platform 9 3/4, steam and noise and the deep red of the express and the organized chaos of a large number of families all trying to manage luggage and goodbyes simultaneously. He stood for a moment and looked at it. Then he loaded his trunk and found a compartment near the middle of the train and sat down and looked out the window at the platform. The compartment door opened 20 minutes before departure and a girl with bushy brown hair and a determined expression looked in. Are you using these seats? She asked. No, Harry said. She came in, levitated her trunk with a wand that was clearly new but that she handled with the confidence of someone who'd been practicing, and sat down with a book already open. A boy appeared behind her, round-faced, a little lost-looking, clutching a toad to his chest with the expression of someone who'd already had a difficult morning. Neville Longbottom, he said, somewhat apologetically. This is Hermione Granger. She said she'd help me find Trevor but Trevor keeps, sit down, Hermione said without looking up from her book. We'll do another sweep before we arrive. Neville sat. Harry looked at them. Harry Potter. Neville dropped his toad. Trevor made a determined move for the door, and Harry, without thinking, had him suspended in midair at waist height before he reached the gap under the door. He set him gently on the seat beside Neville, who was staring. Hermione had looked up from her book. She was looking at Harry with the specific expression of someone cataloging an unexpected variable. That was wandless, she said. Yes, Harry said. Wandless magic at 11 is, technically possible but extremely rare. The literature suggests it requires either exceptional raw power or unusual early development, sometimes both. You're Harry Potter. We established that, Neville said weakly. I've read about you, Hermione said, unself-consciously. Quite a lot, actually. The accounts are somewhat contradictory, which is interesting in itself. The absence of consistent information about someone who should be very well documented suggests either deliberate management of information or an access problem at the source. Which is it? Harry looked at her. Both, he said. She nodded as if this confirmed something. I'm Muggle-born. I didn't know any of this existed until I got my letter. I've been reading solidly for a year. There are significant gaps in the publicly available record about the events of 1981, particularly regarding what actually happened at Godric's Hollow and why you-know-who, Voldemort, Harry said. Both Hermione and Neville produced slight reactions. Neville's was a flinch. Hermione's was the controlled expression of someone who decided to have a considered response to this and was having it. Why Voldemort lost his power, Harry continued. Yes. The public record has gaps because the public record was managed. It tends to be, when powerful people have reasons to prefer a particular narrative. Hermione looked at him with her cataloging expression. You're not what I expected, she said. Based on the available literature. The prevailing portrayal is of someone who would be quite overwhelmed. Starting from behind, essentially. I started from behind, Harry said. I didn't stay there. She considered this. Closed her book, which Harry thought was significant. She didn't seem like someone who closed books lightly. I have questions. I have time, Harry said. We've got several hours. They talked until the countryside outside the window had fully traded Surrey for somewhere greener and more northern. Hermione asked questions with the focused appetite of someone who had been eating everything available and was finally at a table with more on it. Neville, who'd been quiet, interjected occasionally with the specific perceptions of someone who had been raised in the magical world and had a different set of gaps. He knew the social landscape, the families, the weight of certain names, in the way that Hermione knew the textbook structure and Harry knew things that were in neither source. Harry offered information the way he did everything, deliberately, selectively, with attention to what was useful and what was not yet time for. He told them about growing up with the Dursleys without specifying the full architecture of why. He told them about teaching himself, about the library, about Diagon Alley. He didn't tell them about Gringotts or Sirius or the inquiry or the letter. But he watched them both, and what he found was interesting. Hermione Granger was ferociously intelligent and burning with the specific energy of someone who discovered their world was larger than they'd known and was determined to map all of it. She was also lonely in the way of someone whose abilities had always outpaced their context. She wanted to do well at everything and she wanted it so intensely it occasionally made her sharp, and underneath the sharpness was someone who would, Harry thought, be entirely remarkable once she was somewhere that could actually keep up with her. Neville Longbottom was afraid. Not of Harry specifically, of failing. Of being inadequate to something his name required of him. He was a pureblood from a significant family and the expectation on him was visible even to Harry without any reaching, just the observable weight of it. His grand's expectations. The Longbottom legacy. He held his toad like something to hold on to. Harry liked both of them immediately, which was not something he'd expected to feel so quickly or so clearly about anyone. The trolley came. Harry bought enough for 3 people and distributed it without asking, and Neville said "oh" in the tone of someone receiving unexpected kindness, and Hermione said "thank you" and then immediately continued her previous sentence, and Harry thought, yes. These two. The castle appeared in darkness and it was, after everything, still a surprise. Not the existence of it. He'd read enough, been told enough, prepared himself enough that surprise wasn't really available to him. But the scale. The specific weight of it against the sky, lit from within, enormous in the way of things that have been standing in one place for 1,000 years and have gathered significance the way rock gathers moss. The boats crossing the Black Lake, Harry in one with Hermione and Neville and a boy called Dean Thomas who hadn't said much but who stared at the castle with an expression of uncomplicated awe that Harry found, for a moment, almost enviable. The entrance hall. Professor McGonagall, who was exactly what Sirius's story had prepared Harry for, precise and formidable and, beneath both of those things, someone who cared about this in a way that was bone-deep and slightly fierce. She looked at the cluster of first years with the eye of someone who was already sorting them, probably, and when her gaze reached Harry it paused for just a moment. He looked back. Her chin came up, slightly. Assessment complete. He thought he'd been found satisfactory but he couldn't have said why he thought so. The ghost appearing through the wall made Neville stumble backward into Harry, and Harry caught his elbow and kept him upright without comment. And Hermione said that's a ghost, obviously, the school is documented to have 142 of them in the tone of someone annoyed at being startled and handling it through information. Then McGonagall led them in. The Great Hall was everything. Harry ate the description of it whole, the ceiling that was the sky, the candles, the 4 long tables packed with students in black robes, the high table at the far end with the professors. He looked at the high table with the methodical attention he brought to significant environments. Dumbledore was at the center. He was exactly what Harry had spent 6 years imagining and considerably more than he'd planned for. Old, genuinely, profoundly old, in the way that few things are, with the long white beard and the half-moon glasses and the midnight blue robes and the air of someone who had occupied the center of rooms for so long that rooms organized themselves around him without instruction. He had kind eyes. This was the thing Harry noticed first and kept noticing, the eyes, which were blue and warm and full of what looked like genuine, specific attention. It was probably real. Harry had always thought it was probably real, that Dumbledore's warmth was genuine, that his care for the people around him was not performed. It was possible to be genuine in your warmth and still wrong in your certainty. It was possible to love something and still be willing to use it. Dumbledore was looking at the first year's filing in with the expression of someone who did this every year and found it meaningful every time. His eyes found Harry. Harry looked back. Neither of them changed expression. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds and then the sorting was beginning and the moment passed, but Harry had caught it, the small, brief recalibration in Dumbledore's face. The arrival of information he was processing. He knew, then, or suspected. The inquiry conclusions had been delivered Monday. This was September 1st. Dumbledore had had 2.5 weeks with them. He knew Harry wasn't what he'd arranged for. He just didn't know how much. The sorting hat was on a stool and it was old and patched, and when they put it on Abbott, Hannah first, it spent 45 seconds before shouting HUFFLEPUFF, which Harry clocked as a long time and thought about. When his name was called, Potter, Harry, the room reacted the way rooms react to a name that carries weight. The whisper moving through, the heads turning. He walked to the stool and sat down and the hat came over his eyes. Well, the hat said, directly into his mind. It had a voice like old paper. This is unusual. I was told that already this year, Harry thought back. By my wand maker. You've been thinking about this, the hat said. Not a question. You know the houses. You know what they mean. You have opinions. I do. Tell me. Harry thought about what he actually believed about the 4 houses, not what the book said, not what the bias in the available information suggested. What he actually thought, from everything he'd accumulated and everything he understood about systems and what they produce. Gryffindor produces people who are brave to the point of being occasionally stupid, Harry thought. Ravenclaw produces people who are clever to the point of occasionally forgetting that cleverness isn't the same as wisdom. Hufflepuff produces people who work hard and are loyal, and the world consistently underestimates them, which is interesting. Slytherin produces people who are ambitious and strategic and have been painted with a broad brush that has made them defensive in ways that aren't always useful. And where do you belong? My father was Gryffindor, Harry thought. And I've been doing something very Slytherin for 6 years. And the 2 things that have actually kept me going are stubbornness, which is Gryffindor, and patience, which could be any of them. And the person I've found most useful to be is one that none of the houses specifically produce. So, the hat said, with what felt like amusement. Put me where I'll do the most good, Harry said. Not where I fit most neatly. Where I'll be most disruptive. A pause. Disruptive, the hat said. In the good sense. Another pause. Harry had the sensation of something very old and genuinely curious examining him thoroughly. You know, the hat said, in 1007 years of sorting, I have been told many things. I have been argued with, begged, flattered, threatened. Twice I have been put on upside down, once deliberately. I have never before been asked to consider strategic utility. Harry waited. Gryffindor, the hat shouted. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry took the hat off, handed it back to Professor McGonagall, who gave him a look that was approximately 3 degrees warmer than the one she'd given him in the entrance hall, and walked to the Gryffindor table. He sat down. The twins were immediately across from him. Blimey, said the one on the left. You actually argued with the hat. We could hear it going on, said the one on the right. Not what it was saying. Just that it was going on. We timed you, full 2 minutes. Fred and George Weasley, said the left one. Gryffindor since the dawn of time, said the right one. Pleased to meet you, Harry said. They grinned at him in unison, which was slightly alarming and entirely genuine. Tell us, Fred said, leaning forward. What do you argue with a hat about? Placement theory, Harry said. George stared at him. We're going to get on, Fred said to George. Extremely well, George agreed. Hermione landed at Gryffindor with a quiet fierceness. Gryffindor the hat had called after barely 20 seconds, which Harry suspected meant it had found exactly the same thing he had in her and had less complicated feelings about it. Neville, after a long sorting, went to Gryffindor too, and sat down looking somewhat surprised, and Harry caught his eye and nodded. Neville's shoulders dropped approximately 2 inches. Visible relief. The feast appeared on the tables and Harry ate with the steady attention of someone who has spent 10 years being managed about food and is done with that. The twins kept up a running commentary on the school, the professors, the specific hierarchy of student social structures, delivered with the anarchic precision of 2 people who had mapped the system entirely in order to make the most effective use of it. Harry listened and filed and asked the occasional question that made Fred look at George in a way that meant "I told you." Ron Weasley, their younger brother, who was sitting at the end of the table with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone navigating a world full of their older siblings' reputation, caught Harry's eye at one point and looked quickly away. Harry made a note to talk to him separately, when there wasn't an audience. He looked up the table at the high table. Dumbledore was looking at him. He was doing it the way you do it when you're trying to decide something, not overtly, not socially, but with the specific quality of assessment. He looked away when Harry met his eyes, which was interesting, because it suggested that whatever Dumbledore had expected to feel when he looked at Harry Potter was not quite what he was feeling. There was a man at the end of the high table in a purple turban who caught Harry's eye for a different reason. He was young, youngish. Thin. He kept his turban on throughout the feast and held himself with the careful stillness of someone in discomfort, and when Harry let his attention settle toward him he got, not a clear picture, the distance was too great and the hall too loud and Harry's attention already too distributed, but a texture. Something layered. Something with too many surfaces. He filed it. He'd come back to it. The tower dormitory smelled like old stone and clean sheets, which were smells Harry had not previously experienced in combination and which were, he decided, ideal. He had a bed with curtains. His trunk was at the foot of it. His wand was on the nightstand. He lay in the dark after the others had gone to sleep and thought about the man in the purple turban. He'd found out the name at dinner, Quirinus Quirrell, the defense against the dark arts professor. Stuttered slightly. Seemed nervous in the specific way of someone whose nerves were not natural to them but had been acquired. He'd studied the dark arts abroad, someone said, a Hufflepuff 4th year with the tone of someone repeating received information. Ran into some trouble there. Came back different. Different was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Harry turned the texture of what he'd felt across the hall over in his mind. Not just nerves. Layers. Something in Quirrell that had a second register to it, like a room inside a room, like a song being played over another song with the harmonics slightly wrong. He decided to find out. He found out the next morning in the corridor before breakfast. He positioned himself near the staff room door at 7:45 and waited with a charms textbook open. The studying look was one he'd perfected, the look of someone who happened to be present rather than someone who was waiting, and when Quirrell came through the door at 7:52, Harry fell into step alongside him. "Professor Quirrell," Harry said. "I had a question about the reading list for defense. Do you have a moment?" Quirrell looked at him. He had pale eyes and a slight tremor to his left hand that he controlled consciously being visible to Harry as the absence of a natural movement. "Oh, yes, of course, Mr. Potter, isn't it? The question?" "The recommended text lists both the dark forces, a guide to self-protection and curses and counter-curses as supplementary. I wanted to know which you preferred for theoretical grounding." They were walking. Harry kept his pace easy, his tone light, his attention on the conversation. But underneath the conversation he was letting the things settle, the receptive openness, the quality of listening with everything at once. This close, the texture of Quirrell's mind was immediate and strange. What lived in it was Quirrell, genuinely, the man was there, the nervousness and the acquired not natural quality of the tremor and a thread of specific fear that was distinct from the general anxiety. But underneath Quirrell, beneath the floor of him, there was something else. Something old. Something with a temperature to it, cold, actually cold in the way of things that have been preserved rather than things that are alive. Something with tremendous patience in it and tremendous fury in equal measure and a specific attention that was, Harry realized with a cold clarity, looking back. Not at Quirrell. At Harry. Whatever was underneath Quirrell had felt Harry's attention the moment it arrived and had turned toward it like a compass turning toward north. Harry pulled back. He did it cleanly and quickly, the way you pull your hand back from something hot before the burn arrives, and was entirely back in his own head before anything could reach through the contact. He kept walking. He kept his face neutral. I'd go with the dark forces for theory, Harry said. It's more systematic. Curses and counter-curses is more practical for field application. Yes, quite right, Quirrell said, with the distracted quality of someone whose attention had just been startled and was resettling. Very perspicacious, Mr. Potter. Thank you, Harry said. I'll see you in class. He went to breakfast. He sat down between Hermione and Neville and poured himself pumpkin juice and thought about what was underneath Quirrell's floor and what it meant. He knew what it was. He'd have known even without the contact in the corridor, just from the research, the specific temperature, the patience and fury combination, the old cold quality of something that had survived in a diminished form. He'd read enough about the events of 1981 to have a working theory about how Voldemort's defeat hadn't meant Voldemort's death, just Voldemort's disembodiment. A soul without a body required somewhere to live. A compromised, desperate professor with a turban was a reasonable somewhere. Voldemort was in the school. And Dumbledore either didn't know or had decided he did know and hadn't acted yet, which were two very different problems requiring two very different responses. Harry ate his toast. He thought about the dog they'd passed in the third-floor corridor last night, which had 3 heads and the specific look of something put there deliberately. He thought about the sequence of obstacles he'd heard the older students mention in whispers, traps, something hidden, the third-floor corridor the school was officially forbidden from entering. He thought about what you would hide under a school where the most powerful wizard in Britain happened to be headmaster. Something you wanted Voldemort to come for. Something you were using as bait. He put his toast down. He'd been so focused on Dumbledore's management of Harry himself that he'd underweight this other quality of Dumbledore's, the willingness to use the school, the students, the whole structure as the field on which he played his larger game. The Philosopher's Stone, he knew from what he could piece together, Gringotts had relocated something in a high-security operation just before term, and he'd heard about that from Ragnarok obliquely. Something small and enormously powerful. Nicholas Flamel's work. Dumbledore had put the stone under the school. With Voldemort already present, already inside Quirrell. Harry thought about whether this was a trap laid for Voldemort or a test laid for Harry, and realized it was probably both, which was the most Dumbledore-ish thing he could imagine. You've got your thinking face on, Hermione said, without looking up from her book. What does that look like? Harry asked. Completely blank, she said. Which is how I know it's the thinking one rather than the actual blank one, because you're never actually blank. Harry looked at her. There's something in the school, he said. Hidden. Something Voldemort wants. She looked up. I know, she said. I've been working on it. The third-floor corridor, the Cerberus, it's a guardian, it guards something, the configuration of the obstacle suggests, multiple professors set traps, Harry said. Separate challenges. Laid deliberately. Yes, she said. Who? Dumbledore knows Voldemort is already here, Harry said. She went very still. In Quirrell, Harry said. Hermione looked at her book. Looked back up. Are you certain? Yes. How, good ears, Harry said, which was what he told people when the truth was both more and less explainable than they were ready for. Hermione pressed her lips together. What do we do? We pay attention, Harry said. We prepare. We don't go near the third-floor corridor unless we have to. Unless we have to, Neville echoed, which meant he'd been listening. When would we have to? When Quirrell makes his move, Harry said. And when will that be? Neville asked. After Christmas, Harry said. He'll want the stone before the end of the year. He's already in position. He just needs an opportunity. Neville looked at him. You've been here one day, he said. I've been thinking about this for 6 years, Harry said. One day is plenty. October arrived with the specific rhythm of school life, which turned out to be something Harry found he was built for, the structure of it, the varied daily texture, the library. The library at Hogwarts was an event in itself, and Harry spent 3 evenings a week in it in a way that Madame Pants initially watched with suspicion and eventually acknowledged with the professional respect of a librarian for someone who treated books as tools and not decorations. Classes were fine. More than fine for most of them. He was ahead in charms and defense and transfiguration in the specific way of someone who'd been doing this unofficially for 4 years and had the theoretical grounding to know what they were doing and why. He was behind in history of magic because Professor Binns was a ghost who'd been delivering the same lectures for decades and had long since stopped checking whether anyone was absorbing them. He was good at potions, which surprised Hermione and seemed to displease Snape, who'd arrived at their first lesson with the specific quality of someone who prepared for a particular version of Harry Potter and found an unexpected one in the seat. Potter, Snape had said, on the first day. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Draught of living death, Harry said. One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. Called the draught of living death because the sleep it induces is close enough to death to be confused with it in subjects who don't know the counterdose. Snape had looked at him. Where would I find a bezoar, he'd continued. Stomach of a goat. It acts as an antidote to most poisons, which is why it's the most important thing to know if you're ever in a poisoning situation and can't identify the agent. Grab a bezoar first and ask questions later. A pause. And what is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? They're the same plant, Harry said. Also called aconite. Though the name wolfsbane is specifically associated with its use in wolfsbane potion, which, when brewed correctly, allows a werewolf to retain their mind during the transformation. He'd said this last part with the specific, deliberate precision of someone landing information on purpose. He'd seen Snape's face move slightly. There was a story there. He'd heard enough from Sirius, in careful language, about Severus Snape and the Marauders and the specific complicated history of people who'd been young and unkind to each other in ways that left marks in both directions. He hadn't decided yet what to do with Snape. He'd filed the wolfsbane reference as an opening, not a threat, not a demand. Just an indication that Harry knew things Snape might not have expected him to know. Snape had set them to brewing a simple potion in silence and hadn't bothered Harry again that class, which Harry thought was probably as close to a truce as available. The twins found him in the library in October and deposited themselves on either side of him with the energy of people who have been looking for someone and are pleased with themselves for finding them. We have a proposal, Fred said. A business arrangement, George said. We're developing a product line, Fred said. Joke shop, eventually. For now, experimental phase. We need a test subject with advanced magical ability and a high tolerance for chaos, George said. And we need someone who can keep a secret, Fred said. The professors have been unreceptive, George finished. Harry looked at them. What's the product? Currently, a sweetie that makes you burp in different languages, Fred said. We've got French and German working. Portuguese is still causing some structural issues, George said. The secondary project is a firework that writes words. We're working on the vocabulary. Harry thought about this. I can look at the theoretical basis for the language burp, he said. The charm architecture is probably not accounting for the phonetic differences properly. You'd need a translation layer that's more specific, Fred said slowly. He was looking at Harry with an expression that was rapidly becoming the same expression Hermione wore when she encountered unexpected information. Right, George said. Yes. He looked at Fred. That's exactly what we need. Also, Harry said, if you're planning a joke shop, you need funding at some point. I can help with that when the time is right. The twins looked at each other. Harry Potter, Fred said. Our new best friend, George said. Our silent investor, Fred said. Our significantly not silent anything, George corrected. Have you heard him talk? Harry smiled. I'm told I'm perspicacious. See? George said to Fred. Perspicacious. We're keeping him, Fred said. The troll came on Halloween. Harry heard the announcement in the Great Hall, troll in the dungeons, everyone to their dormitories, and he was already moving before the panic fully settled, because he'd registered two things simultaneously. Hermione wasn't in the Great Hall, and Quirrell had been the one to announce the troll, which meant Quirrell had been somewhere he'd created the opportunity. Distraction, Harry thought. Something to keep the professors busy. He caught Ron Weasley's eye across the table. They'd been finding their footing with each other over the past months, Ron's wariness gradually giving way to something more genuine, and said, Hermione's in the girls' bathroom. She was crying earlier, she won't have heard. He was already moving. Come on. The troll was 12 feet of stench and solid muscle, and it had already found the bathroom when they arrived. Hermione was flat against the wall trying to make herself small, and the troll was bringing its club down, and Harry moved without deciding to. He called the club to him, wandless, a clean summons, the club ripping from the troll's grip and clattering into the corridor behind him. Then he and Ron both had wands out, and it was Ron who got the incarcerus on the troll's legs, a clean cast, surprisingly clean. Ron had good instincts when he acted without overthinking, and Harry followed it with a binding across the arms, and the troll went down with the sound of a minor building collapse. Hermione had her back against the wall. She looked at the troll and at Harry and at Ron and said, You did that wandlessly. You noticed that while a troll was trying to kill you? Ron said. I notice most things, Hermione said, which was true. Can you do that again? She asked Harry. Probably, he said. We should go. The professors will be coming. McGonagall arrived with Snape and Quirrell at her heels and looked at the scene, the bound troll, the three students, the club in the corridor. Her expression went through several things, landed on something controlled. Explain, she said. Ron did most of the explaining. Harry watched Quirrell during it, the professor who'd come to find the troll, supposedly, and was now standing in the corridor with his hands folded and his turban straight and his face arranged in appropriate distress. The thing underneath his floor was quiet in the way of something intelligent that knows when to be still. Their eyes met briefly. Quirrell looked away first. November brought Quidditch. Harry had known theoretically what Quidditch was and had not prepared himself for the reality of being 200 feet in the air on a broom that responded to intention rather than input, which was a different kind of flying from anything he'd done before and which was, he found, one of the best feelings available to him. He'd been made Seeker, the youngest in a century, which produced the specific buzz of the kind of distinction that is meaningful in context and meaningless in the longer run, and he flew with the particular rightness of doing something that suited him completely. He caught the snitch in his mouth in the first match. He'd intended to catch it with his hand, but it arrived faster than expected and his reflexes made the decision before his planning could. In the stands, he'd seen Dumbledore watching. Not the match. Harry. He met the look from 200 feet up and then he had the snitch and the match was over and it didn't matter. Christmas. Most of the school went home. Harry stayed. He'd sent a letter to Sirius and Sirius had sent back a box of things, a photograph album, carefully assembled, page after page of photographs that moved the way wizarding photographs move. James Potter and Sirius Black at 17, laughing at something outside a building. Lily Evans Potter looking at her husband with an expression of such specific and fond exasperation that it was almost a word. James holding a baby Harry with the terrified, besotted expression of someone who cannot believe what they're responsible for. Harry sat in the empty common room on Christmas morning and looked at the photographs for a long time. He found the mirror of Eriste on Boxing Day. He found it because he was exploring the castle's less-used corridors with the systematic attention of someone getting to know their terrain, and he turned a corner and there it was, enormous, ornate, reflecting something that wasn't what was in front of it. He stood in front of it. In the mirror, his parents. Lily and James, standing behind him, exactly as they'd looked in the moving photographs. His mother's hand on his shoulder. His father's face doing the thing where he was trying not to show how much he felt something and showing it anyway. Harry looked at this for a long time. He felt it. He didn't suppress it, the specific, enormous weight of what he'd missed, what had been taken, what Dumbledore's arrangement had added to the taking. He felt it clearly and completely and without performing anything about it. Then he stepped back. Because the mirror showed what you most desperately wanted, and if he stood in front of it long enough he would want it so badly it would stop being information and start being need, and need was the thing he'd been careful not to become. He already had photographs. He had the letter. He had the stories. He had what was actually available. And what was available was enough to work with, and you worked with what was available and you didn't spend your life in front of mirrors. He left. He went to the library. He spent the afternoon reading about the Philosopher's Stone and the properties of the Sorcerer's Stone and the theoretical basis of Nicholas Flamel's life's work. When he had enough, he put the book back. He went to dinner. He ate well. He thought about March, April, the timeline he'd constructed for Quirrell's move, the factors he was watching, the specific signals that would tell him when. Dumbledore appeared in the mirror's corridor the next day, Harry had been told later by a portrait who'd seen it, looking into the place Harry had been standing. He wondered what the mirror showed Dumbledore. He thought he might already know. March arrived. Quirrell's hand, reaching for the stone, he thought. The signal he'd been waiting for came from Hermione, who'd been tracking the third-floor corridor with the systematic patience of someone who treats problems as puzzles, and who came to Harry on a Thursday evening with a list of observations that confirmed what he'd already largely worked out. "He's been testing the obstacles," she said. "Quirrell. I've been checking. Something moved in the third-floor corridor. The troll's been restless. He's going to go for it soon," Harry said. "We should tell Dumbledore," Neville said. Harry thought about this. "We should," he said. "But Dumbledore knows already. This is his trap. The question is," he looked at them, "whether we trust the trap, or whether we handle the variable ourselves." "What variable?" Hermione said. "Quirrell isn't just Quirrell," Harry said. "And the thing underneath Quirrell is considerably more dangerous than Quirrell. If Dumbledore's trap accounts for that, we stay out. If it doesn't, how would we know?" Neville said. "We ask," Harry said, and got up, and went to find McGonagall. Chapter 8, End AI Chat 5-hour limit reached. More actions. Claude. Harry used accidental legilimency on Vernon at age 5 and discovered Petunia had been paid by Dumbledore to mistreat him. Write a long-form fanfiction novel-style story based on the above title/concept. The story consisting of 8 chapters, with each chapter being a minimum of 5,000 words. Writing style: published fantasy novel tone, natural dialogue, varied pacing, show don't tell. Write like you're telling an exciting story to a friend. Story flow. Their power and confidence must be shown through action, dialogue, strategic choices, and emotionally resonant moments, not explained through exposition. Don't make scenes become info dumps. Don't write too much description of anything. Keep it straightforward. The pacing of the story should be fast and gripping. Avoid repetition in chapter structure. Each chapter must feel unique, with new developments, character moments, and dynamic stakes. Do not nerf the MC, do not make them hide their powers. If you are making them op, then let them be OP, don't make them afraid of anyone. The writing style should avoid using headings like Scene 1 or Scene 2. Instead, shift scenes naturally using location changes, time of day transitions, or character movements. Do not write in topic paragraphs or labeled segments. Maintain narrative flow through natural paragraph breaks and action-driven momentum. Avoid overly descriptive or flowery prose, only use rich detail. Dialogue should feel natural, conversational, and emotionally driven. Do not use overly formal, expository, or robotic language, even in high-stakes moments. Characters should speak like real people with their personalities, humor, and emotional nuance, especially during arguments, battles, or flirting. Lastly, always prioritize show, don't tell. Let chapters develop organically. Don't overthink variety, focus on good storytelling rhythm. No generic villains, each antagonist should have intelligent, believable motivations. Keep this subplot visible in each chapter without overshadowing the main events. Adventure and character growth. Rich world building woven into action. Write engaging, immersive fantasy that feels human. Chapters must be titled, Chapter 10, Name, and end with, Chapter 10 End. Generation process. First response. Provide a brief story outline, plot, themes, character arcs, chapter breakdown. After outline, write.